and welcome to the Weekly Stuff Podcast with Jonathan Lack
and Sean Chapman.
We are here to talk about stuff this week on the show. We have a busy week. We've got 2 new episodes of Doctor Who, so we're going to keep that train a-going with the episode Boom and the episode 73 Yards. So we'll continue talking about the new season of Doctor Who. We are also we're a couple months late, but we have finally finished it. It's not really our fault. The game is ludicrously long. Some might even say overlong. I don't know who would say that, but some might. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. We are going to do our full talk about that game and probably piss some people off. Sean, quick, one-word reaction to beating the game?
I probably could have finished it about a week and a half ago, but I couldn't finish it a week and a half ago. That game is long, and it is very flat in terms of the narrative. It is the flattest narrative I have ever experienced, and the ending is bad. We'll go through all of it. Yeah. It's the game I'm most perplexed at. It being rated so highly across, it's got a 92 on Metacritic or whatever, which is a very high rating for that system, and it's surprising to me. And I've been going through and reading a bunch of links that I had sort of saved that I wanted to get to once I had actually finished the game, because I finished the game last night. And it's been interesting reading different reactions, but I'm still confused looking at some of the reviews, why it has reviewed so well, because it is not. In its totality, it is not a particularly good video game, in my opinion.
I agree. I think it is a bad game, but we will get into that. It's a bad game I played 80 hours of, so, I'm part of the problem.
83 hours was my final play count.
It's a little longer than me, yeah, but not that long. Not that much longer.
Well, there's definitely a few hours there that were me just hanging that on the pause screen while I went and was doing other stuff for the last week and a half, because my brothers and their family were living with us because their power was out because there's this huge storm. That was one of the reasons why I didn't end up finishing the game sooner. But it was it turned out that was just more interesting to do than play that game. So there was definitely I'm just going to go walk downstairs for a little bit and just do other stuff. Just leave this on the pause screen for 2 hours.
Yeah, we'll get into it. I think maybe we'll do that, and then we'll get to Doctor Who so we can end on an up note, because we've had some good Doctor Who lately. I think it's safe to say.
Yes. All right. Yes. The last 2 episodes of Doctor Who, very good. So
yeah,
polar opposites of quality of stuff we'll be talking about today.
In terms of other stuff, housekeeping, what have we got? Japanimation Station is on a wee bit of a break because we finished the last part where we talked about our splendid isolation of KyoAni, where we talked about a ton of different shows. But we are working on the next part where we will be talking about Sound Euphonium and all of its offshoots, as well as the movie Silent Voice, which is not part of Sound Euphonium, but is directed by Naoko Yamada, and she worked on Sound Euphonium. So that's how we're linking those together. And that'll be premiering June 9th. So pretty soon here, you'll have Japanimation Station back in your lives. Let's see, over on the Weekly Stuff Wordcast, I've had my continuing series on Hayao Miyazaki and Star Wars going. We're up through Ponyo was this week on Miyazaki. I will say that is my favorite headline for that series. The headline is Miyazaki Madness Part 11, Ponyo, in quotation marks, Ponyo, Little Fishy in the Sea. I thought that was a good headline because that's the lyric in the bad English translation of the song. All right. There you go. There we go. And then Star Wars, we are up to the original Star Wars Episode 4, which I timed this. This is kind of crazy how this worked. The first part of our Star Wars series came out on the 25th anniversary of Phantom Menace, and then Part 4, the one on A New Hope, released on the 47th anniversary of that movie. It just timed out that those dates were exactly 4 weeks apart. So there you go. You can read up through that. I particularly like the 3 reviews I wrote for the prequels, one of which includes one of my old Colorado Kids review of Revenge of the Sith from when I was a kid, which is, when I put together the book 200 Reviews that some of these are from, was the review from when I was a kid that I still agree with most, I think, that I read. I'm like, no, little Jonathan had it right. Teenage Jonathan got angsty and mad at the prequels, and then adult Jonathan came back around to realizing they were good.
Yes, we've all been on a long journey. Anyone who grew up with those movies has been a long journey with those movies. But I think a lot of people are landing in the right place now, which is that those movies are good, actually.
I think The Rise of Skywalker, if it did anything for Star Wars, it helped us understand what bad Star Wars actually looks like.
Yes, it made you stare into the maw of despair, and you're like, you know what, we had it really good for a long time. Let's just go back to all that stuff.
Speaking of having it good, you can also read my review of Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, which is out on the site now. Sean, you have not seen this movie yet, right?
Yes, and you are very Furiosa about that, apparently.
No. I was just telling you, I'm a little bummed because the movie came out this week. I'm actually kind of surprised you hadn't seen it, because wasn't that your number one movie of the decade or number two?
Jonathan, I literally just started my summer break. Okay, like
Okay.
I'm dealing with, you know, I'm not getting on the movies as fast as you do.
It's fine. I just thought if there was any movie Sean would have seen by Sunday, it would have been this one, and that's okay. You don't have to. I'm not mad at you. I am sad for you because I think you will love this movie, and you should see it while it's still in theaters. Because I am worried, given the box office, it did like $30 million this weekend, which is a real bummer. I don't think the final numbers are out yet, but like. I'm worried they're going to pull it out of theaters very fast and put it on like streaming, because that's what they've done with a couple movies lately. The Fall Guy, that happened to. The Ryan Gosling movie was in theaters for like 2 weeks, and they're like, fuck it, it's on streaming now. And Furiosa, I will say, is the kind of movie that if you catch, not just you, Sean, but anyone, waits to catch on TV, they will watch it and they'll go, fuck, I should have seen that in theaters. The same way I think you would with Fury Road. It is on par with that movie. It is a very different movie. You can go read my review to get my full thoughts. I'm not going to spoil anything, but I think it's magnificent. If it's worth the 9-year wait, it very much feels like the other half to that film. The kind of thesis of my review is that I think I would not have predicted before Furiosa that Fury Road could ever feel like less than a full movie, and now that it's out, it does feel like one half of a larger thing. And it's a really cool thing that George Miller has done. And I've had fun with Mad Max lately, because I did also go back and watch the original Mel Gibson movies, which I had never seen. I'd only seen Fury Road. And those are great. Those are really interesting movies. The Road Warrior is the one that is like the masterpiece, Fury Road and now Furiosa. But the original Mad Max and Beyond Thunderdome are really interesting. Beyond Thunderdome, the first like 40 minutes of, might be the most gonzo entertaining of those original three. The back half of that movie, a little less so. But it's a crazy series of movies. And one cool thing about Furiosa is it is not just in conversation with Fury Road. It actually brings back some things from the original three that were not in Fury Road, including, just to get everyone, if you haven't seen it, more excited, flying vehicles in the car chases. The one thing Fury Road was missing, and some other things as well. So it's an awesome movie. I'm so happy George Miller is still able to do this. I am worried that this and his previous movie 3,000 Years of Longing, both bombing subsequently, will put him in movie director jail for the rest of his life. But, you know, he got a lot of crazy stuff made while he had the chance.
Yeah. Like, if I were to... I think the reason why I haven't sort of felt the urge to go see it, and this is not a Furiosa problem, this is just like I think this is all exacerbated by COVID as well, but, like, there's just a issue with a lot of media these days where it just takes so fucking long for stuff to come out. That it's been so long since Fury Road that I don't feel the, like, momentum to go see the next one, right? Where it's like, if it was a couple of years after Fury Road, I think I would still be on that high. And feel this like pressure to want to go see it. Like, I definitely want to see it, but I don't feel like this intense like momentum urging me to go see the movie. Like, it's more like when I get the opportunity, I'd like to go watch it. And that's true of so much stuff these days. Where I mean, this is like a Final Fantasy VII Rebirth thing. I mean, it's been so long since Remake, which that game was in development for so long. It'll be like 4 to 5 years minimum until the third one of those games, which is a truly haunting thought in terms of...
It'll be a PS6 game, Sean.
Yes.
After all 3 exclusives for the PS5 come out, we'll move on to the PS6.
Yeah. And it's just like a problem with a lot of stuff. And again, I think for some things, like movies, it is partially just they like COVID hit in this certain time. It's like, I think it just fucked up the development process of a lot of different projects. And then you're just in the space sitting there waiting for like 2 years for another season of a TV show, like 4 to 5 years for another movie to come out. And by the time it happens, I'm just like, I'm okay. I'm not feeling the passion, even if it's a thing that I really like.
I understand that completely, and I've felt that with TV a lot lately. Like, I have still not caught up on the 3rd season of The Mandalorian. I only just caught up on the 5th season of Fargo. That's a little different because Fargo is an anthology, so each season's different. So if you miss Fargo while it's airing, it's there's not kind of that momentum issue. But like, I get it, and I've been thinking like, what is the reason Furiosa has bombed while Dune Part 2, also a Warner Brothers movie, and I would say an equally weird movie. Like, Dune is very weird, Mad Max is very weird, and I think Furiosa is 100% on par. I think it's a better movie than Dune Part 2. I love Dune Part 2, but like Dune Part 2 was a huge hit. And I've been thinking about why is there that difference, and I think part of it is they were on top of it with Dune. Dune Part 2 was like 2 years on the dot. And it would have been out sooner if it weren't for the strikes. So they got that out like really quick for a modern like turnaround for a movie, and so it kept up that momentum. And I understand what you're saying with Furiosa, because I also think Furiosa, the marketing was pretty minimal. This movie did not have a lot out there. Like Anya Taylor-Joy and Chris Hemsworth only kind of just started the press tour this week. I think it only had a couple of trailers. They clearly, between their two big releases, the first half of this year, WB went for Dune more than they did Furiosa. And I get that to some degree. But yeah, and Furiosa has other things that made it a 9-year wait. There was a pay dispute between George Miller and Warner Brothers. Miller went off and made another movie. COVID did hit and delay Furiosa. But Furiosa was actually a movie that was written with Fury Road. 2 scripts were written. They planned to shoot them back to back. If you've seen Fury Road, you probably know why they decided not to do that, because that's a complicated movie. But like, you know, they're very closely intertwined to the degree that, like, I saw someone suggest this on Twitter, and I think it's so true. They should have done some kind of Fury Road re-release. They should have done like a big theatrical re-release of that movie. They should have done double feature screenings, something to kind of remind people, because Fury Road, I think people remember it as a bigger hit than it was. It was not a massive hit. It like made its money back and enough to do a sequel, but it wasn't like an earth-shattering hit. And I think that kind of thing to do a 9 years later follow-up for is just inherently hard, no matter how good the movie is. And I think it's maybe the best movie I've seen this year. And this has been a really good year so far. But yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, it's wild. It's like, it's also, I think the whole thing is one of the things that has like shot Marvel in the foot, is their inability to capitalize on the wet successes they have had. And so it's just, you know, I'm still here waiting for them to say something about a Shang-Chi 2, because I like that first one. I wouldn't mind watching another one, but you know, who knows if they will ever actually do that. Meanwhile, they're like vaguely doing another Captain America, I guess. Obviously not with Falcon as the Captain America now, but it's just, yeah, it's the movie business is a weird place.
Shang-Chi was 2021.
Yeah.
It'll be at least like 5 to 6 years if there is ever a sequel to that. That movie will not do well. I'm just guaranteeing you right now, there is no way there will be a Shang-Chi sequel that is a success 5 to 6 years after the original. That's insanity. And, you know, some of this is COVID. A lot of this was happening before COVID. You know, I think the TV slowdown, which I think has just kind of shot TV in the foot everywhere, is the inability to get more than like 8 episodes made every 2 to 3 years, you know? Yeah. It's wild. It's a weird place we're in.
Yeah, that's why I'm glad that they're, you know, it seems like with Doctor Who, they are in a good place of that they are so far ahead of the curve in terms of filming season 2 and all that kind of stuff, that we should be in a very good spot there. I feel like RTD kind of knew how like deleterious this is on the effect of the audience being able to keep up with and the enthusiasm for a series. It feels like he was like, we got to make sure we're out in front of that thing and keeping ahead of the production.
Well, and you know, this is an issue, and this is not the conversation I expected to have bringing up Furiosa, but this is a really interesting topic. RTD is a guy who's worked in TV forever and knows how to do this. And a lot of the problem with TV now, and this is part of what the writers were striking over last year, is that a lot of the slowdowns and a lot of the things where they've done mini rooms and a lot of the cutting back on writers being able to go to set and work on the shows just means that there's a lot of showrunners now who don't, and this is not a knock on them as people or as talent, but they don't know what they're doing in terms of running a show, because this used to be a really intense apprentice-esque system where you would come up through the ranks and there was plenty of work because you were making 22 episodes a year and you had multiple chances to go to set and learn how this worked, and you would gradually rise up the ranks. You know, if you're wondering why was Vince Gilligan really good at running a show when he took over Breaking Bad, it's because he worked on the X-Files for 8 years and several other shows, you know? And slowly those people are aging out of television. And being replaced by people who often are feature screenwriters who don't want to make TV, but they're not making movies that aren't superhero movies, so they have to go make a TV show out of their 2-hour script, which means they have to make it 8 hours, and it just all breaks down.
Yeah, it's just sort of the woes of modern media and where it's at right now.
It is. I just love that we emphatically took a system that was imperfect and replaced it with a really awful one with
Yes.
streaming. We just made everything worse. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, but it's kind of amazing, but also not surprising that somehow we fucked it up even worse.
Yeah,
The human race story.
This is an exciting start to the podcast, Sean. I guess that was a little bit of stuff. What other stuff have you been up to?
I'm on break now, man. I finished up the school year on Friday. We
Congrats.
on Sunday. Yes,
Applause
thank
for
you.
Sean.
So I finished up the school year on Friday. Then I finished Final Fantasy VII Rebirth yesterday. So now finishing that was where I'm like, and now I'm on break. Well, kind of, because now we're doing the podcast today. So I guess it really will be Monday will be the and now the endless horizon extends in front of me of the 2+ months of summer break, which I'm very excited.
Sean, I'm going to be cracking the whip, though. We're going to be podcasting Monday through Friday, baby.
We'll be doing more podcasting because the podcasting is fun, and I don't have to be then I'm going to have to get up at 5:20 in the morning on the day after we record a podcast. It'll just be I can wake up whenever, I can eat whenever I want, and have it not be a tiny, less than 30-minute long lunch. It's going to be good. It's going to be a good couple months here. Other little stuff I've been doing that I haven't brought up on the podcast before. I've been watching, because we've moved into a phase of Japanimation Station where we're mostly watching either movies or 12 or 13 episode seasons. I've got enough time to watch other stuff. So I finally cracked open a Blu-ray I bought a while ago, which is Sailor Moon Season 1.
Oh, nice.
Something I've been wanting to get to for a while, because I liked Sailor Moon when I was a kid, when it was on Toonami and stuff like that. Obviously, it was marketed more towards girls, but I still liked that show and caught it when I could. And obviously, but I've never really watched any of the Japanese version of it. It's something I just wanted to get to. And I'm most of the way through Season 1, which is 46 episodes, I think it is. So I'm getting near the end of that run. I already bought the Sailor Moon R, which is the second season, because it's fucking great. Sailor Moon, it's really good. It is, the perfect kind of 90s episodic anime where each episode is very self-contained. The writing for the show is super sharp, and every episode is incredibly well paced. It looks fantastic. The art on the show is just incredible, particularly in some of the earlier episodes, because the first half of the season has a little bit more of a horror vibe to it in places with the monsters. In the second half, they shift to having it not less be they are monsters, and there are people who have been transformed by the bad guys into creatures that then Sailor Moon has to use her moon healing escalation and then get them to refresh so they become humans again. But in the first half of the season, there's a lot of crazy horror shit like evil dolls and bat monsters and stuff like that Sailor Moon just straight up murders. She throws her moon tiara at them, says moon tiara action, and they fucking disintegrate, and she kills those fuckers. And they've got emotions and thoughts and feelings, and she just puts them in the ground and doesn't think about it. And it's pretty badass. That sort of softens a little bit in the second half. But the whole just the vibe of the show, the music, the aesthetic, it's all phenomenal. One of the main creatives on the show is the same guy who went on to go do Revolutionary Girl Utena after he finished his time on Sailor Moon, and you can see that so hard. It definitely has this feeling of someone with a very clear creative vision and style who is sort of developing that, and is going to sort of really evolve it into this much more sort of intense, sort of eccentric version of itself when he gets to Utena. But then also at its core, Sailor Moon, or Usagi, the main character, is just incredible. Mitsuishi Kotono, who does the voice, which this is not that much earlier than when she was on Eva as Misato, which is funny because the voice sounds so different, because Usagi is supposed to be in middle school and she actually reads that way. It's not that high, anime thing where it's the character's supposed to be a 14-year-old, but they read as being 20 or something. She legitimately feels very, very young. And because Mitsuishi plays her that way, and it's so effective. And she's an incredibly fun character because she just does not care about being Sailor Moon. She doesn't want to be Sailor Moon. She doesn't want to fight the monsters. She doesn't want to do any of this shit. She just wants to go eat delicious stuff, hang out with her friends, crush on the guy who runs the arcade, and all that kind of stuff. And she just wants to have that life, and is this kind of bumbling idiot, but in a very charming way. And then she just keeps on getting wrapped up into more and more ridiculous nonsense where she has to turn into Sailor Moon and fight evil monsters. And then eventually she learns about she's the reincarnation of a moon princess and all this stuff, which I've started to get into that side of things. But Sailor Moon, it's a very good show. And I'm watching it on the modern Blu-ray releases that Studio Viz did, which are really good. There were an earlier release of sets that were like half seasons that they did, that those reviews for those sets were very poor. Theirs was like DNR'd really bad and stuff like that. The reason why I picked up this set was because they have done a whole refresh of them, and they're just finishing it up right now, the whole classic series. So I think just about now you can watch all of them on these new Blu-ray sets.
I think they just announced the release date for the final season, and I was happy to see that.
Sailor Moon Superstars.
Yes, because I have that first season set also, but I'm kind of waiting to see if they do a complete series set, because it'll probably be cheaper than buying the rest of them. But in any case, they are out, and it is cool to have that show in its complete run. This is basically the same as what the Japanese Blu-rays are.
Yes, yeah, it looks very nice. It's very high quality, and it's that show. It's the kind of show that has such a tactile feel to the image that you need that film grain. It's so essential to the presentation, and it just looks fantastic. So I've been having a lot of fun with that as my own little kind of personal anime side project, where I've just been watching a couple episodes of that every night for a while here.
That's awesome. I would love to watch that show one day. Who knows? Maybe one day there will be a Japanimation station about Sailor Moon. We'll see. But it sounds like an awesome show. That's why I have the Blu-ray too. I want to watch it at some point. I have not been watching so much anime. I've been doing a lot of other things. Part of it is I am moving out of my current place. So I have been slowly but surely packing stuff up into boxes, fixing some stuff up around the house. I'm on summer break too, and so I've been giving myself a little bit of a break. And then I've kind of been doing other just kind of fun stuff along the side that I've wanted to do for a while. Like I said, I watched the 5th season of Fargo. Fargo is one of the best shows I've ever seen. I love that show so much. The 4th season was a massive dud, but it was the kind of dud that like only very talented people can make. Like, it's the kind of swing and a miss that you can only get from someone who's good at making really good art. It's that kind of bad, which makes it fascinating. But then the 5th season was a real comeback. Might be the second best season they've ever done. Season 2 will always be the best. That one is phenomenal. But this one was also great. This one it had Juno Temple and John Hamm, and a bunch of other great actors, Jennifer Jason Leigh, and it was just wonderful. So I enjoyed watching that. I've been reading more. I hadn't had time to read for fun, read fiction books for fun in a while. But, I did. I returned all my nonfiction academic books to the library. And when I say all, I mean I brought a giant box full of about 40 hardcover books to the library and looked like a crazy person returning them. But if you don't know how it works at colleges, grad students, we get our books, we can check them out for a full year, and then we can renew them whenever we want. So if no one wants it, it's just yours until you graduate. So I did finally bring back all my books and cleaned that part of my apartment out, and that was nice. And now I'm getting to read what I want. And I've been on a science fiction kick. I've been on a kick of I want to read cool sciencey stuff where I feel like I'm learning things. And so I've been reading, because I saw a little bit of this show and I talked about it, the Netflix show 3 Body Problem. And I said, the show seemed kind of awful. I didn't really like it. But the story underlying it, I wanted to know more about. So I finally picked up and have been reading the original trilogy by the Chinese author Liu Cixin, who wrote these books. The 3 Body Problem, The Dark Forest, and Death's End are the 3 books. And I'm in the middle of The Dark Forest right now. And those books are super fucking cool. They are the hardest science fiction you will ever read. And they're also super different from any American sci-fi I've ever read. And part of that is coming from a different culture. The 3 Body Problem, the first book in particular, is really heavily informed by the Chinese Cultural Revolution, where about half the book takes place. And some of the political undercurrent of that. But also, I think Liu Cixin, who is one of the world's most famous sci-fi authors, just has a really interesting way of thinking about stories and about the world. The 3 Body Problem, one reason I think the Netflix show doesn't work, in addition to being Benioff and Weiss, and I don't think they're super great at this anymore, is that my reaction reading that book is that it's an unadaptable book, because it is not structured like any kind of filmed narrative media you've ever seen. It is much more akin to the book equivalent of a point-and-click adventure game like Myst or something, where the protagonist, Wang, is not really a character. We know nothing about him. We know he has a wife and kid. We never meet them. We never know what he thinks about them. We know he works on nanomaterials. We don't know what he really thinks about his work. He is purely a vessel. He is someone who is encountering this mystery, and he is going around the world of the story trying to figure shit out, and he's talking to the characters who have the actual personalities and arcs in the story, and he's figuring out what's going on. And it will often be he'll meet someone, and then there will be a long flashback as we learn their story, and then he'll go to the next place. One of the baffling decisions that Netflix show made is it split that character, Wang, who has no character, into 2 or 3 characters. I'm not kidding. Which feels like the most baffling thing I've ever seen a TV show do, because if anything, you kind of would eliminate that character, I think, if you were adapting it. You wouldn't, like, beef him up into multiple parts, which is a weird thing to do. But it creates this story that is, like, so invested in kind of the mystery and the science behind it. Basically, the entire first book is learning the premise of the story. Like, you don't really know what is happening until the very end of the book, and then you get the full picture of it. And it makes it really hard to explain to people. It's one of the reasons why I think it would be very tough to adapt for any kind of TV or film, because it is basically weird science-y things are happening around the world where the immutable laws of physics seem to no longer be immutable, and you're trying to figure out why, and that answer is the entirety of the book. And it makes it super engaging to read. I found it really interesting. And then it sets up a story that in the next 2 books is much more about kind of a generational saga over hundreds of years of human development than it is about any kind of individual protagonist, which is something Liu Cixin does in a lot of his work. The Wandering Earth, those movies are based on his short story, which I've also read, is like that as well. And it's really cool. And I like reading this kind of science fiction, and I also like reading books from other parts of the world, and it's awesome. It's fun to read something like this.
Awesome. Yeah, that's very cool, because I obviously, now that I'm on break, I also want to be able to read. It's one of the ironies of being an English teacher is that you don't have time to read things anymore. Because I had read through, and I just want to pick these up again, because I got all of the Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi light novels from Japan. Like, I just ordered a physical set of it because that was actually phenomenally cheaper than getting them online. And I got about halfway through them because I finished The Disappearance of Suzumiya Haruhi, which is the 4th one, and I got about halfway through the 5th one, which is a collection of short stories, which is about up to where the anime ever got. So, like, I read Endless 8 as a short story, was the last thing I read, which that's a fascinating thing to read, just because it is, like, it's just take any of the random episodes of the Endless 8, and it's just like that as a short story. It's just very funny thinking about what the anime version of it is this whole, like, avant-garde experiment in televisual medium, and then here's this, like, very cool and well-written, but, like, a fairly straightforward Groundhog's Day style sci-fi story, with the big twist being it is only in the last loop, right? You're only in the last loop is what that story is as a short story, but it's very good. The thing with those books, though, is kind of like with the series, The Disappearance of Suzumiya Haruhi as a book, that series accelerates in quality so tremendously, it's ridiculous. Like, all the other previous books and short stories are fun. The Disappearance of Suzumiya Haruhi as a novel is absolutely phenomenal. It made me appreciate the movie even more in some ways, because you see the adaptational choices they have to make, which are interesting because they adapt that novel very literally almost all the way through. Like, there are very minor details of, like, physical things the characters do, of, like, Nagato reaching out to grab the club application or the resignation form, and she reaches for it and misses and reaches again. Like, little tiny details like that are described specifically in the novel that the movie also then puts in. But the crazy thing about the novel is getting to the end of it and then realizing, oh, right, the movie version has this whole long kind of abstract sequence where you get this visual representation in the main character's head of everything he's been feeling and thinking throughout this crazy story. And it's him sort of exploring it with this huge monologue he's narrating. Well, in the book, it's just a, like, 20-page monologue of Kyon, the main character, talking to himself, and it's so good. And it's just word for word, basically, the end of the movie. But reading it as a book, it's incredible how well that plays and how effective it is. Because the series does a very interesting thing that I'm curious how the, like, English translations stylistically do this, because it's kind of a weird thing, but it makes a little bit more sense with how Japanese block out quotes. But you have this thing where Kyon is your narrator in the Haruhi series and the novels. He is narrating the whole books, so you're in his head the entire time. And there are times where he will say things that are dialogue that are marked off with brackets, which is how you use basically the Japanese equivalent of quotation marks, where you know he is literally saying this thing out loud. But then there are also times where it is just integrated into his monologue. He thinks of like a sarcastic comment or something to himself, and then one of the other characters responds to that comment, thus directly implying this is not a thing he thought, this is the thing that he said out loud, or potentially he said something that is the equivalent of that out loud, if not word for word. And it's part of the stream of consciousness style of the writing, is you just get wrapped up in his internal monologues, and then other characters interrupt those internal monologues, effectively responding to some part of it. And it's an interesting, like, kind of stylistic device where you can kind of draw a distinction between what are the things that he is thinking that then he is sort of seemingly with no filter just saying out loud to the point that they don't even get dialogue sort of notation, and then what are the things that he is intentionally saying to other people that are pieces of dialogue that he is formulating to express himself with intent in the world. And it's like an interesting way of sort of drawing these two different elements of how he expresses himself. When you get to the end of the disappearance of Suzumiya Haruhi, they use that mechanic as a way of how he is interrogating himself. So in the movie, it's him looking at himself in the reflection in the imagined classroom in his head, where he is now, he steps on his own head and all that stuff happens. Whereas in the book, it is just switching between internal monologue voice Kyon and external dialogue voice Kyon, even though there is no external dialogue, because it is all obviously just in his head and him just digging into himself and ripping himself apart for all of his like hypocrisies and stuff he knows that are in him that he's been hiding from himself from the whole time. And it's just a absolutely phenomenal piece of writing. But I got to that part and finished this Suzumiya Haruhi, and that was right when the state standardized tests in Texas started up, and so I was trying to keep up with it and started doing the next short story collection, and I was like, oh no, work got too intense that it was too hard to find time to read. So I want to pick that series up again because I'm right at the point where it's the new stuff that were never adopted in the anime. So but if people have not checked those books out and you like the anime, like, I would almost even suggest if you don't get into the earlier ones, just skip to Disappearance. Because obviously, if you've seen the anime, you know all the plot stuff. But the Disappearance of Suzumiya Haruhi, the other books are well written. That one is, like, especially well written. And I think you can see why the KyoAni staff would have wanted specifically to get to that book and make that book an end point. Because it's a really, really great piece of young adult fiction.
Yeah, I read the first two books and a little bit of the third. I think that one starts with the baseball story.
Yes.
It's the boredom.
That's the first short story collection.
Yeah. So I have, that's another on my list of things to read that I want to get back to, and I love them. And I'm reading in the English translation. And I was just looking through on my Kindle app to see if I could find a good example of what you were talking about. Because a lot of what you were saying does resonate with what I remember of the books, because they are extremely stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
And the English captures that. It looks like but I couldn't find exactly how they're translating exactly what you were talking about. I would probably have to jump to the part from Disappearance to see the clearest example of that. But a lot of that comes through. It is a good translation. It's got a lot of it feels like something with a very distinctive voice. So yeah, I love those books as well.
Yeah, reading is fun, but it's hard to find the time for.
Yep, which is why we're starting our new podcast, Reading Rainbow.
I don't. Hopefully, nobody's taken it before. I think it's a brand new term. There's no way we could possibly get sued for Reading Rainbow. Our new podcast. I think.
Yeah, and if that guy from Star Trek, Geordi LaForge, ever wants to come on for no reason whatsoever, he's welcome.
Yeah, I think we should come up with a nice tune. Also, maybe we can get Thomas on that. I just think it would be really good in some maybe old school graphics. Maybe put out some VHS tapes of the podcast. It'd be pretty good.
I do think if we ever do a consistent Jonathan and Sean talking about the books they've read segment, we do need to get Thomas to make a Hatsune Miku cover of the Reading Rainbow song.
That has to exist. Good. Someone must have already done Hatsune Miku does Reading Rainbow.
If they haven't, we know Thomas did the Haruhi song. Yes. In Reading Rainbow, or in Reading Rainbow style, in Hatsune Miku style. Anyway, I am looking this up on YouTube, and I haven't found anything yet, but I will look again, because now I'm getting she has a lot of songs with the word rainbow in the title. That is messing up my search. All right, Sean, deep breath. You want to talk about Final Fantasy VII?
Oh, I'd love to talk about Final Fantasy VII, but I feel like we're going to have to talk about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth.
Yeah. All right. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Spoilers from here on out. Sean, I enjoyed parts of my time with this game a lot. The further it went on, the less I enjoyed because of, I think, what you were saying earlier. The game is incredibly flat. It is the same activities over and over again throughout the end of the game, and they never really complicate or evolve. It is the same story. We are following the dudes in black robes. It barely develops at all. Cloud is the flattest he has ever been because we are at a part in the story where he is kind of stuck in a rut, and we never see a Cloud with real personality. And then the end of the game is fucking terrible and one of the worst things I've ever seen. And by the end, I really desperately just wanted to be done with it. It is way too long. It is not really what I want out of a Final Fantasy VII Remake. And I think in the end, my personal opinion was it did not have much to say about the video game Final Fantasy VII at all. Yeah. I think it is a kind of fun Final Fantasy VII themed arcade experience or theme park experience for a while, for maybe 20, 30 hours. But I don't think it has anything of substance to reflect on that game. And that is incredibly disappointing.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think there's kind of like two major places where the game fails. And one of them is the story, like as a whole, and especially like the sort of the main story, which is just absolutely dreadful. And then the other side is the game design piece, where I think that side is more complicated because there are things about the game that are incredibly fun. Like, I like the combat. I like some of the mini games. Mostly it's Queen's Blood. I think the Chocobo racing one is a fun, like, Mario Kart Lite. There's a couple of other ones that are like fine. And there's generally like, I think the checklist open world, the like, let's time travel back to 2013 and just like do one of these in the open world slop. Like, I liked those games in 2013. There was something satisfying about running around the open world and just doing your open world slop and checking things off your checklist and doing this challenge and that challenge and this thing and the other thing. And then eventually they go, oh, and you got all of them. And then it checks off the last thing and a graphic comes up and says complete and you get a trophy. And you're like, amazing. I have done something very valuable with my time here because now all those things that were on that list, they have all been checked off. And therefore, I have taken control of this chaotic and meaningless life of mine for one brief second where I have done all the things this game asked me to do. Like, there's something like in your lizard brain that is satisfying about that stuff. But I think
a little bit. I think there is something satisfying the first time, the second time, and then the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time, you want to die.
Oh, it has diminishing returns, absolutely, for sure. And the game goes on for too long and does too many of those, and it spaces them out in a way that's very awkward and uneven and unbalanced. We talked about this last time, where the first half of the game has very little of it, actually, and the second half of the game has, like, only it, and it's just very weird, and it feels like it's confusing that the game is constructed that way, because you don't really understand why would you have made the two halves of the game so unbalanced in terms of what kinds of content is there. But like that stuff I find generally like either fine or at various points I found very engaging. For my issues with the game design is more whenever it would then go into a designed section and narrow down into, and now this is your focused narrative sequence, a dungeon, whatever. And in those moments, I think the game just generally falls apart. And it is like, like the in-game, like sort of the in-main story designed big boss fights, I hated. The ones where I had to fight the giant monsters out in the open world where I did all the combat challenges, that I really enjoyed. And some of the like VR missions I really enjoyed. But when I have to do a giant ridiculous spectacle boss fight that then interrupts me every time I try to do something good with the combat with a big cutscene that then like nullifies all the damage and all the work I had done, it pissed me off over and over and over and over again. I think the way the combat works with dungeon-type enemies gets incredibly tedious because the game is not fun to fight the same enemy types repeatedly over and over and over again because that experience never changes. The game is so poorly designed around risk-reward mechanics in dungeon sequences because there is no real meaningful resource management. Like, if you think about a JRPG, the way that a JRPG traditionally is designed, your like classic turn-based JRPGs, and it's true of modern turn-based JRPGs like the Persona series, they are less about you having very complicated combat mechanics, and it's more about how do you use those combat mechanics to most efficiently get through combat encounters in order to be able to endure this sequence to get all the way through, explore all the dungeon, right? This is what turn-based combat with random encounters is all about, is the endurance of working through the area and being able to get through and manage your magic points and your items and all that kind of stuff. Those mechanics are completely useless here, at least on the regular difficulty, which is all is accessible to you for the first playthrough of Rebirth, where there is never any like fear of my magic has run out or I do not have enough items or any of that to clear this area. In that respect, it just plays like an action game, and all that stuff resets so frequently you never have to think about it. And so the combat in the designed dungeon sequences is just incredibly dull, incredibly repetitive, leading up to boss fights that are just annoying and grating because they take your control away from you so frequently, preventing you from using the combat in the way that you want to tell a story that is incredibly flat and never really resolves, and then also typically is sprinkled through there some sort of unique mechanic, the bane of which is the fucking catchy box throwing one, which are puzzle type mechanics that are never developed, never evolved on in any way, never iterated upon in the dungeon. If you compare this to like Persona 5 dungeons that have puzzle mechanics that they then reiterate and do more complicated versions of, and you take what you learned the previous time and you use that to try to advance your understanding of that mechanic with new, surprising, and intriguing challenges. This game does not do any of that shit at all. And so, like, those main sequences just become the most frustrating slog, dragging you through what feels like amateurish game design, where like they force you to repeat things constantly. There's a refrain throughout this game that they always make you do things 4 times, which is one time too many. As per the law of video games, you only do things for 3 times the same time, and then you move on. They constantly make you do for the thing 4 times in a row, but don't change things, and it's just... I just cannot believe this game is designed this way. Like, in those respects, it's substantially worse than Final Fantasy VII Remake, a game I have fairly fixed feelings on. But that game, which was mostly long linear design sequences, did not have these same kinds of problems. Like, that game had its own big pacing issues, but it wasn't this stuff. And this game, in those sequences, is such a huge step back, and it just gets worse and worse and worse, that it's one of the main reasons why it took so long for me to finish the game, and why I ended up playing 83 hours, is because I did not want to do the main story stuff. And even if I was kind of tired of the open world stuff, it still was more interesting to me and more tolerable than the idea of going through another one of those dungeon sequences. So it just kept putting it off time and time and time and time again, and it was very frustrating. This is my Final Fantasy VII Rebirth therapy session.
I agree completely. So you're fresh on, just to be clear, I finished this game about 2-3 weeks ago. Sean just finished it last night. So he is the one who is going to be a little more punchy here, if you are wondering why. That is the reason. If we were doing this 3 weeks ago, I would be slightly incoherent in my punchiness. You are being very coherent, though, Sean. But no, I agree with all of that. That Keshi dungeon is terrible. I mean, I do think, like... This is part of what frustrates me about the kind of critical reception of this game, is that the back half of this game in particular, amateurish is the right word. There is some of the worst game design I've ever seen in a AAA game in the back half of this thing. The design of the Gongaga region, I also think the design of the Cosmo Canyon region, the flight controls on the Chocobo there, the fact that things that control in one region, you go do the same thing in another region and they control differently, which includes like the Chocobo and stuff. That Keshi dungeon is fucking terrible, almost unplayably bad. There's a lot of things like that in the second half of this game, whereas I do think the first like 30 hours or so are pretty tight in a lot of ways. They have issues, but they're not as problematic. And the other problem that I think we need to get into is that this is basically 2 games that don't really touch. The open world stuff has nothing to do with the main storyline. Nothing. In the main quests, in the main missions, in the parts where characters open their mouths and talk, you barely go into those open worlds. There are parts where I'm pretty sure you could skip the entire region if you were just doing the main missions, and you would never touch those places. And, like, that in and of itself is not necessarily a problem. Like, you know, there are plenty of open world games where, like, if you just mainlined it, you would miss a lot of stuff. But the best open world games are ones that in some way meaningfully encourage you to go understand the world and make the world part of the story. Like, if you compare this to something like Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, which are not the Zelda games, which are not as narratively heavy, although I think they're narratively heavier than Final Fantasy VII Rebirth.
I mean, they're actual stories. Like, yes. I don't like the story of Breath of the Wild really at all, but it's a story. Yes. Rebirth, this doesn't even really get to the point of being that.
No. But like those games, in every way encourage you to go look at the world, walk through the world, understand why does the world look this way? What is over that horizon? Like, they really want you to be at one with the world. And I think that is true, especially as of late, with a lot of open world games. Elden Ring is a masterpiece of this. And this game, like all the stuff out in the open world, it could effectively be a big box with nothing in it. It's a checklist, and it's a checklist of things to do that are the same in this region and the same in that region. The things that are unique to one region are very hit or miss. And like, the only region that actually kind of you have to engage a little bit with, like, the geography of it is Gongaga, and it's the one that has seemingly most annoyed the most number of players. I actually didn't hate Gongaga as much as some people, because at the very least it asks you to kind of like look at trails and find your way through things, whereas everything else is just follow the counter. This is just wallpaper. It doesn't really matter what it looks like. And the story never has anything to do with those places. You never go out and it's like there's a mission where you really have to go explore the world and find things and think about that, because the story missions and the parts you're talking about, Sean, funnel you into places that you never go back to, that are not part of the open world, that are not part of the larger world that they are creating. And I think that's just a huge mistake, especially because at the very beginning, I think it works at the very beginning because the start of the game is the same point as in the original Final Fantasy VII, where you are set loose on the open world. And as in that game, there's this sense of like relief, the claustrophobia lifts, you get to go explore and learn what the world is like. But in Final Fantasy VII, that is very intrinsically tied to the main plot of the game. And when you go explore, you find places that continue the story or enrich it in some way. And in this game, it's you go do the checklist with Chadley, a character who might as well not exist in the diegesis of what like goes on the summary of the game, right? He is immaterial to the main plot of the game, but that is, like, if you were to count it out in hours, Chadley is the most important character in the game. You do way more with him than you do with anyone else. And so you have all of that stuff, but it never kind of comes back and touches upon or reflects on what you are doing in the actual plot or with the actual characters of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. There are a couple of side missions you can find in the open world that have good character material. I think particularly this game does very well by Red 13, and there's a lot of fun stuff to do with him out in the world. And there's good pieces of that. The open world stuff can be fun, but part of why it has a diminishing returns is that, especially the further you go on, the more you realize how detached it is, and that the actual plot, it doesn't really matter that you're in Gongaga. It doesn't really matter that you're in Cosmo Canyon and you're exploring these places, because the story doesn't have anything to do there. It doesn't have anything to tell you there. It has no real connection. You know, I've seen different theories about what this game is quote unquote about, and my number one pushback on anything that people will say, I often hear, this is a game about loss. No, it's not. This is a game about going out and doing chores for Chadley. Because if you're going by what does the bulk of the game ask you to do, what is the controlling idea that you see through your main engagement with the game, it is checking stuff off a checklist for a little boy who annoys you. That is most of the time you will spend with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is doing that. Whereas, if I were to say about Elden Ring or Breath of the Wild, let's take Breath of the Wild. What is the controlling idea of Breath of the Wild? It is about going out and learning from the environment, and that this world that is alien to you has all the secrets of what happened and what you need to know to save the day are there in the body of the soil that you are walking through. And like, that is the idea behind that game that it executes through gameplay. And I also think that's true of Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII, the game from PlayStation 1, its idea is that you get out of Midgar and the world kind of sucks, and it's dry, and it is sad, and it is dark, and you are going around and realizing how barren and broken this world is. But that is not an idea that ever comes to the surface in Rebirth, because you are going around a world that is full of minigames and full of colorful characters, and even the slums where they are enslaving people and making them fight in gladiatorial combat has fun minigames for you to do, and they're goofy and fun. If you want one good signal of how much this game kind of misunderstands tone and like what the state of the world is the fact that it uses the main Final Fantasy VII theme by Nobuo Uematsu so little. It has one version in the first region you go to that is a very triumphal version, and it has the like jangly guitar version in Cosmo Canyon, but it never has the main version of it because the Final Fantasy VII theme from the overworld in FF7 for PS1 is sad. It's really sad. You go through and you're like, oh fuck, this is bumming me out. And Final Fantasy VII Rebirth doesn't really ever want to bum you out. It wants you to go do fun checklist items for Chadley. So maybe I hope I'm being coherent here, but this is one of my big problems, is it is two separate games, one of which is full of just awful design in your main story path, which also just has no real story to speak of. And then the other is a big open world checklist that sometimes is fun, but has less than nothing to say about Final Fantasy VII as a story, as a world, as a set of characters, as a set of themes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a few things there where, if you're looking at it as an open world game, which, it's structured very differently than your average open world game, particularly a modern one where you typically have like a very contiguous world. This is more like zones, which is, there are plenty of games that do these kind of open zone structure. It's kind of what this is. But if you're thinking of it as an open world game, the biggest thing it's lacking is any sense of exploration or discovery, because there is none. Like, there's nothing to be found in the world that is not put on your map for you, right? I mean, it's the classic Ubisoft. You go climb up the tower, you press the button, it puts the like, here's the 4 things to do here, go there. There's nothing to be found that is not those icons. I mean, other than the only thing is treasure caches, but those are completely meaningless. I mean, items in this game might as well not exist for how pointless they are. There's such a small handful of weapons you get that those are all on the main story path. There are no random weapons to be discovered in the open world. Accessories are completely superfluous. Like, they might as well just be materia slots because the stats are so meaningless with the way that the combat works. You could never upgrade your fucking accessories and it would not matter. I stopped at a certain point because I realized it didn't matter, and I fucking won the last boss fight of this game very easily because it's like, you don't need that shit. This, like, I stopped giving a shit about my materia at a certain point because about maybe halfway through the game, you finished getting the materia that actually is useful to you, and they start giving you weird materia that's like, swap my HP and my MP stats. I'm like, well, that's, a fun novelty materia, but I'm never going to fucking use it unless I'm doing some weird playthrough. And so at a certain point, there's even the things that could have been there to discover, like accessories, materia, weapons. They don't even do those. Those aren't in treasure caches. Those are all on the main path. There's nothing meaningful to be discovered out there. And so I'm someone who, when I play open world games, I try to fast travel as little as possible because I'm a strong believer in that fast travel destroys open world experiences. It like just crushes them down into purely the checklist and gets rid of all the things that can happen along the way, which even in classic, open world slop Ubisoft games, even if there's not always like bespoke activities that happen along the way, there are still interesting things that happen. If you play Far Cry 3, which is kind of, to me, the granddaddy of this specific sort of design that really cracked it, that a lot of games model themselves after, you don't want to fast travel in that game because there's all kinds of crazy nonsense that happens, like tigers going and attacking random villagers that you can go, or like fires getting set off by Molotov cocktails while you're driving through and being like, oh shit, what's going on here? There's so much random, interesting emergent systems and stuff that cause interesting things to occur that, to me, that's like the hallmark of an open world game. I want to ride my horse through this landscape. I want to experience the feeling of traveling through this world and have this long consecutive experience that's not broken up and chunked up into little loading screens that I'm going through all the place, right? This is people's big criticism of Starfield, is that is a game that is designed in such a way that you cannot really have that experience. In Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, I mean, you can just choose to ride your chocobo everywhere. And obviously on their first time going through a specific region, you have to before you unlock the fast travel points. But as soon as I have like a thing where, there's an activity over there, I have a fast travel point that's like a little bit closer to where I am right now, I'm just going to fast travel there. Because there's nothing to be had about moving through the open world. Moving through the open world is just a thing one has to do in order to get to the spot where the activity is. It might as well be fucking, and I would, in some ways I would prefer it be structured like Crisis Core on the PSP that just gives me a list of missions that are my side missions, and I click that and it just puts me there, and I go and I do the thing for fucking 1 minute, and I go and I leave, right? And it's like Peace Walker is another game that has that design, Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, that I think works really well. That in Metal Gear Solid 5, they kind of dump all that shit into a giant empty open world. Although that, that's a little unfair to that game because it does have more interesting stuff going there. But still, it's a similar kind of problem.
Yes.
Where, like, there's nothing to be done here. This is the worst possible version of an open world where they have not thought about either the narrative and sort of like, emotional significance of this place with a history to it. Most open world games are like so much about history, like Elden Ring, Breath of the Wild, Genshin Impact are about like history and exploring this history and understanding your place in the world. Final Fantasy VII, the original, is also about that. And so there's the narrative impact to it that is important for well-designed open world games, but there's also a like gamic experiential significance to it to well-designed open world games where there are things that are interesting to be discovered or things that are interesting that can happen to you on the way that are not player determined or player generated. They're just things that occur that you now have to compensate for or deal with, and that's interesting and engaging. That doesn't happen in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Enemies spawn in the same locations every single time. They are the same enemies every single time. Nothing wanders, nothing moves, nothing's different, nothing is surprising, nothing is unexpected. It is just a list of activities. You just happen to ride your chocobo there instead of picking them from a list of options on a menu.
I mean, Sean, I've been playing Crisis Core. That's what I've been doing since I finished Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Is I went and played the good one, the one of the two other good ones, Final Fantasy VII or Crisis Core, and I'm doing a full completionist run and finishing everything in Crisis Core, so I'm almost 30 hours in, and it's such a better structure in every way. I could go on about it. People are probably sick of me going on about how much I love Crisis Core, but it is so much better.
Yeah.
And you're right about that, and it is. I read an interview with one of the people from Insomniac. I forget if it was the director or the designer, someone high up at Insomniac, about Spider-Man 2, where he said that they seriously considered cutting fast travel from Spider-Man 2 because they realized with the way they built it, it was so instantaneous and it was so fast that they worried it would discourage players from experiencing the New York they had built. And they ultimately decided, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give players the choice. We're going to do our cool instantaneous fast travel, but we need to really double down on making it so they won't want to use it. We want to have it there, but we want people to choose. And they thought it could be even more powerful if it was there as something you chose not to use. And so they said, we want to make it fun enough to traverse, have enough things in the world, all of that, so that you are not only are you not incentivized, but you don't want to. And I think that's very true of Spider-Man 2, because there is no version of fast travel that is as fun as swinging up with your webs and then getting your, glider out and flying like you're fucking Superman through the city. And I think that's true of a lot of the best open world games. Like, the best open world games are the ones that, even if they have fast travel, that is an occasional convenience. It is not the main way you are going to want to go through the world. And yeah, at a certain point, like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth does this fog of war thing where, the whole map, you have to physically stand in the location to unfog it. Most of my maps are fogged up because if it doesn't have something there that's on the checklist, why would you ever go there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's like no reason. It's one of the things that's funny about those areas is that there's so nothing to find that, yes, even if you're doing a fairly like completionist run, which I didn't do for the open world stuff, I did check off all the checklists because that's honestly pretty trivial. I stopped doing all of the side quests. I did most of them. At a certain point, I was like, I'm good, and stopped doing that. I certainly didn't do all the minigame stuff. I very much did not do all the minigame stuff. When I went back to Golden Saucer, and they're like, and now you can do harder versions of these minigames. I'm like, great. Well, I didn't like any of them the first time. Do you want to do terrible Punch-Out? No. Do you want to do terrible like Outrun with the motorcycle? No. Do you want to do a terrible like shoot 'em up game? Fucking please, God, no. I will go do my Queen's Blood, and I will leave. Thank you very much.
Yes. But
yeah, like you in that open world, you just never experience it because there's nothing there to be experienced, either from a narrative point of view or from a video game point of view. It is totally extraneous landmass they have decided for whatever reason to include in the game. And you just never go there, you never visit there, and it's, yes, there's a lot of fog of war. Even when I've checked off all the fucking shit on my checklist, there's a lot of fog of war on those maps.
Yes. I don't even where to go next with this fucking game, Sean. I mean, and I think this also pertains to the combat, which I have complained about, where it can be fun. It's this weird divide where I agree with you. I think it is reasonably fun, although I still think it is a really imperfect combat system in the open world. And then in the, designed encounters, it's awful. It's almost unplayable. It's unbearable. Like, anytime you're wondering, when was Jonathan doing his I want to die tweets about the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth combat system? It was never in the open world. I can guarantee you that. It was always in the designed combat encounters, with the Keshi part making me want to murder people.
Yeah. It's, for me, like, I really like the combat system overall. But there are a lot of things holding it down. Like, and one of those things is the design of those dungeon areas. Like, this combat system, I think, would be great in a Monster Hunter game, because that's what it's fun. It is fun to fight, like, bespoke encounters with big, complex enemies that have unique weaknesses that are fun to figure out how to exploit using your set of characters. And so that's why the open world combat stuff is really fun, because you skip all the junk fights. You maybe do one or two of them. And so you fight, here's a couple of, like, simple versions of these enemies just when you're in the first time you're going through that area. Then you go to the individual unique combat encounters that give you special variants of those enemies that cause you to think more about your strategy. And it's like, okay, that is a fun way to do this. And so you'd go and do those, and then once you've done all of those, it unlocks a big, crazy monster that you then do a very big, unique fight with those, but also not one that, like, does a big cutscene in the middle of it. That then, like, negates all of your damage. And that's fun, because the combat is fundamentally this thing about you setting up big combos and trying to do large amounts of damage in a short window. Like, that's how the stagger mechanic is designed. That's how most of the characters in the game are designed to be played, is either they are trying to use them to get the enemy into the stagger window, or you're using them to set up what you're going to do in that stagger window, like Aerith, who is a character that is good only for doing big short bursts of damage using her magic spells and setting up all of her wards. But you have to spend a lot of time and build the character to set up all these wards and all that kind of stuff that then allows her to do damage. And in the handful of times where it actually lets you do that, it's really fun. Like, it's fun to do combos where you set up Aerith's ward that doubles the spells that are in there. Then you switch to Yuffie, you use her doppelganger, you get enough stuff on her that then you can use the ultimate, like, Firaga or whatever, that takes up to 2 ATB bars. But if you're doing that in the one that doubles the spells and your doppelganger, it does, like, 4 instances of that spell. You can do huge amounts of damage. It takes a long time to set up, though. It takes, like, a couple minutes, because you have to get all this ATB across different party members. That stuff's super fun and interesting. The problem is, for the big boss fights in the game, by the time you've set up that mechanic, you've hit the boss to a health threshold that then puts them into some weird state that now, it just ate up all my magic damage, or now the field has changed, and so Aerith's shit has just been thrown away because it's located physically in the room, and so it then disappears on you. There's so many instances like that with the boss fight where I'm having fun playing the mechanics of the game, trying to set up things and use my abilities in interesting ways, and then it just pisses it all away because their cutscenes and that design of that fight is more precious to them than the player being able to engage with the systems. To the point where I just don't understand why things like limit breaks and the synergy abilities and all that stuff even exists in the game when you barely have an opportunity to use it, because the only enemies with enough health for you to be able to use that stuff very actively, summons, are the same way. There are so many mechanics that are about these long fights that with these big payoffs of big dumps of damage, that the main bosses, you barely use that shit. And it's annoying. And it's also stuff like, if you want to level up your limit breaks, they tie it to that synergy ability that characters get. So you have to charge up the synergy thing, And if you want to do the level 3 limit break at the end of the game, you have to do that fucking twice. Like, how are you supposed to do that? Everything dies. Do those mechanics just exist for hard mode? Well, too bad, because I'm never going to play fucking hard mode because I didn't like the game the first time through. I would love to have interesting boss fights and interesting mechanics to play with the combat, because I do think the combat is fun, but they just don't design encounters that allow you to use the combat in a way that's interesting. It would be like if you were playing Monster Hunter, but they gave you Devil May Cry enemies to fight all the time. You're like, this doesn't make any sense. Everything's just dead immediately. What's the point of all these mechanics I have that are about setting up long-term damage and big, huge combos like 20 minutes into this fight to just do crazy damage when everything dies 5 minutes in? It makes no fucking sense, and it just drove me insane. And that's like doubly so for the random, they're not random fights, but these sort of normal level enemy fights you get in the dungeon areas, where it's just the same weak ass enemies over and over and over and over and over again. No variations, no complexities, nothing. And it doesn't have any resource management mechanics, and it doesn't have any mechanics that accelerate your ability to finish those fights. So you're just doing the same fight over and over and over again. Whereas if it's a Persona game, once you've figured out how to beat a configuration of enemies in a Persona, the next time you get that configuration of enemies, you're done with that fight in fucking 15 seconds. It's over. It's done. You've solved it. You figured it out. You do it again. You move on, or you try to figure out a strategy that uses less SP and spend even more time on it. But in this, there are no mechanics that make those normal repeated fights interesting, because also it's not Final Fantasy 16 or a Devil May Cry game where fighting the same kind of enemies over and over is fine, because there the mechanics are expressive enough that's not about this enemy being interesting. It's about how can I use all these different crazy moves to finish them in the most stylish way possible. This combat system doesn't have the flexibility and isn't designed to do that. So the fights they ask you to do are just fundamentally mismatched with the combat system that they have created. Like for 90% of the game, that's how that works out. And it just drives me crazy because I like the combat a lot. I just wish that I could actually engage with it.
So I agree with this completely. And I think one thing I realized throughout the game is that I've had a lot of frustration with this combat system, as listeners to this podcast know, from Remake to this game. And I think I realized it is not so much that I think the combat system itself is bad. I have said that, but I think I am more on your side now, Sean, where it's like, I think it is used wrong. Because there would be parts where I would find myself going, I'm really enjoying this. And it would be the kinds of things you're talking about, like in the simulator or in some of the checklist items. But if you put me in the main story, it's just the combat system is wrong for almost everything you do. Because if it is your normal kind of mobs of enemies, just the basic ones that populate a dungeon, the combat system is like bringing a fucking nuclear weapon to a knife fight. It is so overcomplicated, right? It is like a big, because it is way more akin to like an MMO or a Monster Hunter than it is a normal JRPG fight. And imagine fighting, Dragon Quest slimes with this boss, with this system, right? It's just, and that's what it's asking you to do. It's asking you to do enemies that take 2 hits with 7,000 options in front of you, because the combat system is so ludicrously complicated. But then the big boss fights are so scripted that you have no room for expression. And so there are some things on the margins where the combat system can be fun, but they are on the margins. And I know someone is probably listening to this screaming, there's hard mode. But as you said, Sean, that only unlocks after you've played 100 hours of this motherfucker. So no, that doesn't count. Or there is the post-game thing with all the big, really tough bosses. That's the Kazuya Nakai character. In Japanese, it's the guy voiced by Zoro. And you have to get all the proto-relics to find him. But
Gilgamesh.
That's an end-of-the-game separate thing. Yeah, Gilgamesh. And that also doesn't count. That is you've played 90 hours of this thing. Now maybe you get to really engage with all the combat systems. But the game is bad at asking you to engage with the combat. And my friend Chris here at the University of Iowa, if he's listening to this, he's probably already had an aneurysm and turned it off because he loves this game. And I'm sorry, Chris. I'm sorry we're assaulting your baby. But he started making in the spirit of friendship, making fun of me because he realized that I was not doing anything with all the weapon abilities in the game. I had not even really realized that system existed. Because because for one thing, with Cloud, I'm not using anything other than that Buster Sword. I've played Crisis Core, and I know what Zach went through to get him that sword. No, fuck y'all. I'm not using anything else. So I wasn't even really playing around with the weapons. I didn't really care about that. I didn't really realize what it was. But I had made comments about Aerith being useless, and this made Chris pull his hair out. He's like, no, Aerith is like really good, and he explained it to me, and I'm like, well, what is that move? And he's like, it's a weapon ability. I'm like, what the fuck is a weapon ability? And he explained all this to me and was exasperated. It was a little bit like the bandolier scenario, Sean, in Red Dead Redemption.
To be fair, it's worse than the bandolier. Like that is a very fundamental part of the combat, though it is telling that you didn't need to learn that system, because
that's my point.
It's not actually important for most of the characters. Like Aerith is the character that it is like fundamental to how she plays, to the point that she's useless until you get about her third or fourth weapon. Up until that point, I think it's Radiant Ward, I want to say, is the ability you get that creates the really big magic circle on the ground that upgrades her attack and then also makes her dodge better. Until she gets that, she might as well not be a character that exists in the game.
I agree. But like, here's the thing. Do I feel a little silly for not really realizing that? Yes. But also, in a good video game, that wouldn't be a possibility, right?
Yeah.
Like in Super Mario Brothers, if you got to the end of Mario Brothers and went, I always dodge those mushrooms, what the fuck were those for? Then you would sound like a crazy person, right? Because that's a fundamental thing. And it's not really fundamental in this game other than for Aerith, but hey, there's 6 other characters, you don't need Aerith, because for most of what you do, you don't need it. So like, once I learned about the weapon abilities and how to get them, I did spend a few hours, and I got everybody's weapon abilities. They're very easy to, you just level up the weapon a little bit and you get them. And here's the thing, I thought a lot of them were really cool moves. I thought they were really fun. Cloud in particular has a lot of cool weapon abilities. I went and spent a bunch of time in the simulator so I could play around with these weapon abilities. But here's what frustrated me about the end of the game. I had so little reason to use any of them. I had so many cool abilities, but a lot of them have, as you say, they have timers associated with them. They need build up. And there's just, like, I think the last dungeon of the game is the best dungeon in terms of actually having some mechanics that, like, it feels like a real dungeon that someone designed.
Yes.
The problem, though, is that even there, I would get through every fight, and I would try to set up cool things, and I would just keep being frustrated because, again, it is that bringing a nuclear bomb to a knife fight thing. You so rarely need this combat system is so complicated for what the game is. Like, this game wants something that is basically a simple character action system, like Final Fantasy XVI, but 30% less complex, right? Like, that's what it really wants. That's what most of the main course of the combat is, but it doesn't have that. It has something that would be right at home in an MMO, and it's just so wrong for the game that, you can miss the weapon abilities and you could beat the game and you could be fine. You would never know they existed.
Yeah, because for Cloud, you mostly just need focused thrust to do the stagger damage and then Braver to do regular damage. And that's,
you have those at the beginning. That's most of what I used.
With those. And that's about it you need for him. And again, for most of the characters, like Barrett has his fundamental abilities at the beginning. Tifa, I think, has hers. She's got unbridled strength and dive kick and overpower strike. Like, that's all you really need for. I mean, that's mostly what so my party, I mostly used Tifa and Yuffie, and I had a Cloud there. I honestly didn't even use Cloud that much at a certain point because Yuffie is the best character of the game. Yuffie is ridiculously, it's way too powerful. Yuffie's so fucking powerful. She exploits everyone's elemental weakness without having to do anything special. They made her stupid powerful when you get that doppelganger thing that just does her, everything she does just gets doubled up. But also it follows her everywhere, so you don't. It's like Aerith just looks pathetic in regard to Yuffie because Aerith has to put a thing on the ground that she has to stand in to double her spells. Yuffie gets a thing that just doubles everything she does, including her weapon abilities. It goes everywhere with her. I think it even doubles up on items. I might be wrong about that, but I think it does that as well. But it's just like, I don't know who is the crazy Yuffie fan at Square Enix that just decided her to make the way overpowered character, but she is. So I mostly used her, and I used Tifa when I wanted to do big burst of damage and just do her unbridled strength, and then use her 2 triangle attacks. That killed 99% of everything in the game if I ever needed to get to the point to actually even use it. But, like, that kind of stuff is moderately fun, but generally doesn't ask you to use most of those mechanics in the game. It doesn't ask you to use the weapon abilities outside of like the two you really want for Yuffie. And Yuffie is the character that by far has the most wide-ranging and most well-designed weapon abilities because they tie into each other and they build a whole play style. Whereas for like Tifa, you don't need anything other than unbridled strength and overpowered strike, really. Even dive kick is just like a nice convenience to end a fight a little bit early. None of her other stuff is like that. It's not particularly notably better than her other moves. It doesn't really replace her other moves. It doesn't have a clear functionality. So it's like her basic setup that you have at the beginning of the game, there's never really much of a reason to navigate away from or do anything more complicated than that because it's more than enough to deal with any enemy that you have encounter. And that's true of basically almost all the returning characters. And in fact, almost all the returning characters, as far as I can remember, you're just re-unlocking the same abilities they had in the previous game. There might be one or two new ones when you get near the end. I have, it's been so long since I played Remake, but certainly most of them I remember having been from the original game. You're just, in not only the abilities, the weapons themselves, you're just getting those again and re-unlocking those same weapons as you're also re-leveling up all the same materia. There's not that much materia that is different from the previous game, so it's just sort of, they're asking you just to kind of do this all over again. And that's another element of it that gets tedious in regards to the combat. Like in general, I think character building in this game is very poorly done. The fucking skill tree is the most pathetic skill tree I've seen in a very long time. It is just a way to gate synergy abilities and the element abilities they have because they realize that materia is a terrible system, and so they keep on having to come up with ways to make the materia not make the combat worse. So instead of having to have your different elemental materia on characters, they just give you an ability that doesn't use MP, that just does all the different elemental damage because they realized it's just a pain in the butt to always have to have all the elements covered on your characters in every single fight, especially early on in the game. So they just say like, well, let's just make a thing that means that that's not important. So you never have to use an elemental spell until like 60 hours into this game, at which point enemies become strong enough that those original abilities are no longer useful. So that's a hilarious element of the game that they just sort of, designed the materia system to be even more useless because they know that it's bad. But other than the synergy abilities and those 4 abilities you get on every single character, all the other slots in your skill tree are useless. They're all shit like, do 3% more critical damage. Oh, yes. You get this is literally one, you get +3 maximum MP. Oh, thank you. I can cast half of a cure spell now with my +3 maximum MP boost. Thank Christ, Aerith, man, she was just sort of had enough MP that I never had to think about it. I never used a single item to regenerate MP once in the entire game. Not even once. I didn't even know if I had them because I didn't even look for them because I never ran out of magic power. It just never came up. There's so many ways that you get that shit back. There's so many like abilities you get in the game that also give them temporary infinite MP with some of these synergy abilities. It was just like, nope, I never have to think about it. So why in the fuck would I spend 15 skill points getting +3? Like, it's like 5 level ups to get +3 max MP. It's just fucking ridiculous. It's a system that might as well not exist. The weapon abilities are not the weapon abilities, the weapon unique materia or whatever it is that you get, like the weapon upgrades. Those are the same way. 90% of them are useless, and the small percent of them that are useful, that just determines that you're going to use that weapon as far as I'm concerned. Like Tifa has a couple that allow her to have her 1 level up unbridled strength thing active at the beginning of the battle, or there's a chance that she has it active. I'm like, well, that's way more interesting than +5% crit rate. So it's, right. There's like most of them are just random filler abilities. And then you've got fucking materia. And if people, longtime listeners of our Final Fantasy VII podcast will know, I hate the materia system. It's other than in Crisis Core. Put that aside. Crisis Core does it very well, but Crisis Core also does it completely differently. But going back to original Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VII Remake, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the materia system sucks. It is a terrible fucking mechanic. It is useless, and all it does is add unnecessary complexity into a thing that a skill tree would be more than sufficient to deal with, and it's just a thing that eventually I just didn't want to deal with. Like, when they give you Ketchi back at the very end of the game, I was like, I know they're probably going to make me play as this fucker in the last boss fight, but I literally so don't want to deal with going through the menus for the materia, of which I have like 200 materia, and I don't want to scroll through a linear list of all the materia. I'm just not going to put materia back on this fucker. I don't care. I do not care. I'm not going to change his weapon. I'm not going to change his accessory. And you know what? It didn't matter, because in the last boss fight, I just used his standard weapon abilities when they made you basically play as him and one other character. And I did that with him, and then I switched to the other character and just used them. Because the materias, it's just... it doesn't do anything. I can't understand why they've stuck with this system. Again, they've come up with all these ways to try to mitigate the random complexities that it adds to the combat system that are unnecessary, like making it annoying that you can't deal with elemental weaknesses depending on what you've slotted in specific characters when you do not know what elemental weaknesses you're going to be dealing with, versus a standard JRPG party setup where you just design and build the characters from the beginning with their skill trees so that you can deal with all that, and all the mechanics in the boss fights and the enemies are designed around understanding what kinds of abilities are available to the characters, because those are the abilities those characters have, rather than having to be attached to a weird item that you have to independently level up and swap in and out, or if there's any fight that wants to be complicated and use that system, would then ask you to then go and remove around all this fucking materia on characters. And I'm not doing that. I'm not going to go through this list and spend 10 minutes swapping materia in and out to do your special fucking combat challenge or whatever that's a pain in the ass because you need to use the time spell or whatever it is that I don't have currently equipped on the character that needed equipped to do this efficiently. I don't want to deal with it. It's a waste of my fucking time. Like, why is it designed this way? Crisis Core... you only have one character, so you don't have to move them around between different characters, which creates a giant pain in the ass. Like, why is there not a loadout system that allows me a default setup for my materia I can switch back to, so I don't have to spend 10 minutes out of the fight trying to remember what materia did I have in my characters that I liked in the first place to fix it if I had to change it for their special fucking fight. Crisis Core, you only have the one character. That's not a problem. And then they allow you to fuse the materia to make unique materia that have interesting different effects on them, thus making the fact that it's an item a meaningful element of the design, rather than it just being, it might as well be a spell in your skill tree, so that you don't have to populate your skill tree with +3 fucking max MP bullshit. I hate it.
Slow clap for Sean here. I agree. And here's the thing, and I think it's so much worse in Remake and Rebirth than it was in the original Final Fantasy VII. Like, It's kind of annoying there, but it is totally manageable. But the just 75 layers of added complexity sucks. And I've been playing Crisis Core again, and even, like, I am at a point in Crisis Core where I have broken that fucking game. I can do 99,999 damage on everything all the time, but I'm still fucking around with my materia, and I'm like, can I get this one materia where I have plus 700% HP? Can I get that to plus 1,000% HP? And like, I'm playing around with that and like just optimizing my build. And so you have that. The thing is, with like, by the time you're at Rebirth, the amount of work you have to do on every character, and there are 7 characters, and they all have an upgrade system that is way more complex than anything in Crisis Core, but it's for 7 separate fucking characters. And so, and Crisis Core does still have your loadouts, like you were just suggesting, for your one character, so you can like keep, like, this is my materia set for thunder, this is my materia set for fire, or whatever you want. But no, it's a giant headache. There's so much boring ass menu management in this game, and if you're listening to this and you're going, no, materia is the best thing ever, I just have to beg you, if you are someone who loves Final Fantasy VII and Remake and Rebirth, and you haven't played a lot of other JRPGs, please go buy a copy of Dragon Quest XI. Yes. You can buy 11 or you can buy 11S. Either one. They're both good. And I would beg you to play that game. Because Dragon Quest XI has the best, most elegant, most fleshed out JRPG, like traditional JRPG battle system in the history of video games. I think that. I think you think that, Sean.
Yeah.
And like that will show you like the elegant, normal, sane person's version of this thing. And if you think like it doesn't have as much depth at the beginning because you're not fucking around in menus as much, just play some of that game and you will gradually realize that game has basically infinite depth to it, but it is through the actual manipulation of the mechanics, not the manipulation of settings in menus. And I think that is one major difference here.
Yeah, and it's like, because the other thing is like, there isn't anything fancy with the materia system. It doesn't give you anything, and that's my problem with it. Like the Crisis Core version, the idea that your weapon or all of your abilities, your magic spells, and like a lot of your stat boosts are attached to specific items, that has been contextualized in a way in the system that makes it the fact that it's an itemized makes sense. Here, it might as well just be an innate ability the character has, like, oh, the thing that they added to this game because they realized the elemental affinities and the materia system was a pain in the ass and it didn't work well. So they just gave characters the ability to exploit the elements without having to use materia because it was an unnecessary thing on top of it. Did that make the combat worse? Did the fact that they made the materia less important to the way characters play somehow make it weaker than Remake? No, it made it better. It was more efficient. You didn't have to deal with all this shit. And it's like, lo and behold, the materia version of that mechanic added nothing. There was no benefit to it. Like, I feel like, I feel like I lose my mind when I see people talk about the materia stuff as if it's like a really great system, when I'm like, if it's so good, why has literally no fucking other video game ever tried to do this system? Versus, look at all the games that have copied Diablo 2's skill trees. Like, it's like every fucking RPG released after Diablo 2. Why? Because the Diablo 2 skill tree system worked really fucking well. So lots of people play that where it's like, you know what? These skill tree, including fucking Final Fantasy games, are like, man, these skill tree systems sure are good. Let's just do that from now on because it's a good, simple, efficient way to have complex character builds that the player has some authority over. Versus this materia bullshit that nobody in their right mind wants to touch with a 20-foot fucking pole because it's just a pain in the ass and adds nothing to the system.
Or, if you're going with Final Fantasy X has one of the most influential battle systems ever designed. Like, it is so many JRPGs after 10 use what 10 does in terms of having, like, the order of players on the side of the screen, the way you can swap in people from your back party. The Digimon story game, Cyber Sleuth and Hacker's Memory, which we love, it's just the Final Fantasy X battle system with elemental affinities added. Like, that's it, and it's fucking brilliant and perfect. Like, 7 is, like, the least influential of Final Fantasy's various battle systems it's had over the years.
Yeah, because it's just the materia mechanic. It's terrible. It's not like particularly worse here than it was in Remake. It's mostly the same. But it's just I had to play 80 more hours of a video game that had it, so I have to get it on my chest.
It's worse because the game is so much longer. Yeah. There's more characters you have to service. It's worse for those reasons. All right. Should we talk about the story?
Yeah, I think that's enough about the mechanics of the game that are flawed. The story, Jonathan, if one can call it that.
It's not really a story.
Where do you even start with this thing?
Yeah. My instinct is I want to jump ahead to the ending and talk about what a clusterfuck it is. But I think that's wrong. I think we need to talk about, before the terrible, terrible, horrible, no good, very bad ending, we need to talk about the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad 80 hours preceding it, where nothing happens. Just nothing. Nothing happens. And I think my brother Thomas, who also played this game and hated it, had a really good insight on this. And this was a frustration that I think I felt, but I couldn't put to words. But Thomas had a really good observation here, which is that Cloud is really boring in this game. And that sucks because Cloud is an awesome character. And Cloud has a lot of personality, but you would never know it. And Thomas is someone who has played all of the Kingdom Hearts games, much to his chagrin. And he said the problem for him with Cloud in this game is this is the Cloud from Kingdom Hearts, which is the version of Cloud that Tetsuya Nomura likes that is just your brooding sad boy. And he's very soft. And he's very soft in terms of like his characterization. Like there's just nothing really there. And he's very flat. And he's very stoic, but there's like nothing going on. And Thomas, after he played this, he finally took my advice and played Crisis Core, also loved it. And he said one of his favorite things about Crisis Core is that even though Cloud is catatonic for most of that game, when he is not catatonic, he has a ton of personality. And you get to see like who was Cloud as a kid before the incident in Nibelheim that turned him into the person he is in Final Fantasy VII. And it just hit him that like how flat Cloud is in this game, because you're in a stretch of the story where Cloud in the original FF7 is not really the focus. We're learning about the other characters, and he hasn't yet gotten the revelation about himself. So we don't have all his character material we got in Midgar, and we're waiting for kind of the turn that happens when Aerith dies. And they haven't done anything to augment that. And if anything, they've flattened him out more. And it seems like part of the reason for doing this as 3 games is because Tetsuya Nomura doesn't want to do the really rich, interesting version of Cloud. He wants to do the flat version of Cloud, who every 10 hours or so gets a headache and a flash of Sephiroth, and nothing of note actually happens, but you get to pretend he is complex because he has a J.J. Abrams mystery box hanging over his head, and nothing really happens with him. And then you get to go on, and then it happens again, and it happens again, and it happens again, and he never changes in the course of this game, and that is a huge fucking problem. And I think it's true of most of the game, though. This is just a very flat game where your goals, what happens, the way the world evolves, is just it is one of those mosquitoes in amber from Jurassic Park. It is just a fossil.
I think there's so much about the overall design of the story that it's doomed from the beginning, effectively, because I think this version of Cloud here is very boring. And it does feel like it's like the Cloud that Tetsuya Nomura likes, because it's the Cloud you get in Kingdom Hearts. It's also it's one of the biggest issues with Advent Children, is they just decide, let's just get rid of all the character development Cloud had at the ending of that game and make him the same Cloud you had at the beginning of Final Fantasy VII, who's riddled with angst but is also very stoic and badass, when the whole point of the character is that is a put on. That is not who he truly is. Right? And he's trying to be this person that he's not, as all of the characters are trying to be people that they are not. They are all trying to fit into archetypes they don't really belong to, and it's only once they realize that they are adults and they have moved on in life and that it's okay and to embrace the future rather than cling to this past of a person they wanted to be rather than the person they actually are, that they are able to then do things and save the world and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's just the simple structure of the characters of the story of the original game. Not anything fancy, just very well done there. And it's fucking infuriating to have to play through, if you're including remake, like 100 hours plus, like 110 plus hours of these 2 games without ever getting to the like interesting version of this character. And so the Cloud thing is a big problem, but it's a problem for every character in the game, with maybe the exception of Nanaki/Red 13 and Barrett, because those are the only 2 characters that have their big story stuff happens in the course of this game. All other characters, Aerith, Tifa, Yuffie, Cloud, they are stuck in a loop. They are just doing the same things over and over and over again. How many scenes in this fucking game does Cloud have a weird psychotic break where he sees a Sephiroth vision or whatever, and then Tifa and Aerith share furtive, nervous glances at each other, but say nothing about it? How many fucking times does that happen? It's like every area it happens 2 to 3 times, because that's where those characters are at this point of the story. They like kind of know something weird is going down with Cloud, but they don't really say anything. The problem is them not saying anything really starts to stretch the point of like believability when it is over the course of an 80-hour game where you have seen him almost kill Tifa in a new sequence they added and all this other shit. I'm like, how have they not just said, hey, Cloud, why don't you just stay in Gongaga for a while and just sit this one out, bro? Like, we'll go. You are like a liability to yourself and others. This is clearly a problem, and it's just like the fact that they're still adventuring with this dude at this point is pretty wild. It's kind of hard to believe that they wouldn't have just said, let's get you some help, because we are not going to be able to save the world if you're going crazy and attacking people and murdering people and all this other shit. But they can't do that because that's not what happens in the story of Final Fantasy VII. So because they've just kept repeating those handful of character beats over and over and over and over and over again. And I think for me, if I'm like playing script doctor here and trying to think of like what is the fundamental choice they made that kills this game, it is the choice to end this game with Aerith's death. It is so bad. It is so doomed, the game, because there is nothing that can happen. If you want to follow the plot of Final Fantasy VII, you can't do anything if your starting point is the Nibelheim flashback and your ending point is Aerith's death. it's so the wrong point to end the game. They should have gone to the Northern Crater sequence where Cloud, it's the breaking point where Cloud gives the black materia to Sephiroth again. Sephiroth sort of starts to undo some of Cloud's memories. Cloud realizes he's not who he thinks he is. He doesn't know who he is yet, but he realizes the Nibelheim flashback was a delusion. And so his personality completely breaks down. He gets lost in the live stream. Sephiroth gets away. The party is captured by Shinra. If you want to do your big Empire Strikes Back ending, that's your big crazy cliffhanger at the low point in the story that gives you a good point to end, that's the point to do it, because that allows Aerith's death to be the big downturn at the end of like the second act, if you want to think of it that way, or it's the 10 if it's a Kisho Tenketsu traditional Japanese structure. It's the twist, right? That's how that would work if you had paced the game out that way, and it would give you a story to tell. It would give you things that can happen that change over the course of the story and characters that can evolve. I know I'm explaining very basic concepts there, but it is what it is. Like it's all flat. It's all static. There's no story arc. If you're drawing your here's my story arc with introduction, rising action, climax, falling action, conclusion, it doesn't have that. It's just a flat line all the way to the end with a little tiny blip where Aerith maybe gets killed at the end, whatever, we'll dissect do stupid shit they do there. I mean, she's dead, but whatever. That they kind of have that as a blip at the very, very end of the story, but there's no build-up, there's no release, there's no denouement, there's nothing to the story because they decided to end it at a place that makes no sense based on where they started.
I agree. It is the thing that in the original Final Fantasy VII, this stretch of the game is known as the weaker stretch of Final Fantasy VII, where you leave Midgar and you're in the open world at the beginning, because it is a little aimless, although there's a lot of good stuff there, and it's only like 10 to 15 hours, not 80 to 120. So, different set of problems. But, the thing is, the game picks up when Aerith dies because that is the turning point in the story. All stories need turning points. That's what makes them into stories where things are flat for a little bit and then they shift in a new direction and the status quo changes. And that is the point in Final Fantasy VII is Aerith's death. But this game ends with Aerith's death, so you are waiting. This is part of what killed my momentum in this game for a while, is that you're waiting for the turning point, for something dramatic to happen, for these characters to be thrown out of their comfort zone a little bit. And it doesn't happen until the end of the game, because that is when Aerith something in this version, but dies in Final Fantasy VII. And so you're right. The actual ending point would be exactly what you're describing. Your Empire Strikes Back style. There's been a big revelation. Everybody is separated. Everything's fucked up. Because then Aerith dying would be your second act turning point that would change the face of the game a little bit. Not a little bit, a lot, going into that final arc. The other problem is that because the game has made this choice to make Cloud extra flat, it has also done the inexplicable thing of foreshadowing the Cloud twist way more than original Final Fantasy VII does. It's all over this game. It is constantly needling you with Cloud is not who he says he is, something that is doubled by the fact that Zack Fair is all over this game, and good luck if you didn't play the original and Crisis Core. You will not have any fucking idea what is going on. The game just expects you to know all of that because it's not actually a remake. It's some weird fucking other thing that no one wanted. But anyway, so you have over and over again it's doing this, but in this game, and I have to stress, it does matter that this is its own game that is $80. I don't fucking care that there will theoretically be another game in a few years. It matters if this game is good. And a big problem is that it spends a lot of time foreshadowing and teasing out the Cloud thing, and that is not resolved or furthered or complicated or given a turning point at any point in this full 100-hour, $70 game. It never goes anywhere. This was a big frustration for my brother Thomas, too, that he told me over and over again, is that, playing a game that keeps doing the Cloud foreshadowing and then just never gets there is so ludicrously bizarre. It would be like if The Lord of the Rings The Two Towers had made the choice to have Gollum talk about Shelob every 5 minutes and then still end with them not at Shelob, right? Uh-huh. The Two Towers made the wise choice not to really foreshadow Shelob until the very, very end, so you know that Gollum has a bad plan for them. But it's not like you're watching it going, when are they going to get to Shelob? Because they keep telling us we're going to Shelob and then ending before Shelob. You'd be like, well, what the fuck was that? But that's not what they did, because Peter Jackson's smart. This sucks.
Yeah, because it's, if you're looking at the starting point, which is the Nibelheim flashback, like, your expectation then is that the material around that thing is going to be the core, the spine of the story, which is in many ways the spine of the story of actual original Final Fantasy VII. But you don't even need to necessarily get to the full revelation of it, because obviously if you did that, there would be a comically thin slice of Final Fantasy VII left to do at the end. I mean, not a thinner slice than what they did for Final Fantasy VII Remake, so it's not like it's impossible. Yeah. Again, the Midgar section is less than an hour long in the original Final Fantasy VII. So
it's a little longer. Every time we mention this, you put it down more and more. It's more than an hour. It's like 3 to 4.
Yeah, if you play very slowly.
It's still tiny.
It's tiny. It is a little tiny. It's like a 2-minute section you get a little. There's a text box that says they were in Midgar for a couple of seconds.
Your general point is completely correct. I just
it's a tiny,
not just one
insignificant, might as well not even exist sliver. I don't even think I think that was in like the cell phone game. I don't know. I don't even think that was in original Final Fantasy VII. But point being, they've picked very odd, uneven chunks in strange places to chunk up Final Fantasy VII into this bizarre trilogy project. Because the thing is, if you ended with Aerith's death, I don't think that that's an impossible spot to end the story if you started from the beginning. If the beginning of the game was where we see Aerith, she's praying to the live stream, camera zooms up, you see Midgar, you then go down to Cloud, he does his shit, he then meets Aerith, and then they go on, or he sees her selling the flowers, then he falls into the church later, right? All that stuff happens. If that's your beginning point, then ending with Aerith's death and having it be this big story about Cloud and Aerith's relationship and how it develops and then how it ends here, sort of as an ending point. Obviously it's in spirit, it continues past this. That's a story. You can do that. That would work as this big tragic romance thing. That's not what I would do, because I don't, that's not for me what those relationships are. But you could totally tell that story if you wanted to split this up into multiple pieces. But the problem with starting it with the Nibelheim thing is that Aerith has jack shit to do with that part of the story. She has no involvement with it in any way whatsoever. It's not her part of the story at all. So when you're doing that, and it's all about Cloud's past and his relationship with Tifa and his memories and all that stuff, that's not Aerith's side of the story. That's Tifa's side of the story. So that means that by the time you get to the end, the Aerith's death had no impact on me in this game, not only because they ruined that scene and how they present it. They do that. It's ruined there. Even if they did a really good job of doing that scene, I still don't think it would have any impact on me in this game, despite the fact that I love Aerith as a character. And I adore Sakamoto Maya's performance as Aerith. It's fantastic. People are missing out on the English version, even with the subtitles, because there's no way to translate her weird cadence and the weird grammatical structure for Japanese, which is very sort of playful and strange. But it's a beautifully written character, beautifully well performed. I adore Aerith. She is so poorly served in this story because her stuff feels like it's off on the side because of how they've chunked it up. All of her important stuff from the early parts of the story are not in this game. And so they have to come up with little moments like the Loveless thing to sort of build a moment for Aerith in the story, because they don't have any of her big moments really in this game because they were all in the previous one. And so then when you end with her death, it's well, I like Aerith in theory, I have a lot of attachment to this character, but not because of this video game. Yes. And so I was left incredibly cold. And again, that's not even me taking into account the poor way that it's executed on screen. All the things around her death in this just don't work for me at all.
Yeah. And we'll get to that later, but let's talk about the chunking up, because it fucks with the characterization so much. Because if you're talking about the main party, you do have in the span of Rebirth, the second game, you have Nanaki / Red 13 has a lot of his character material.
Yes.
Barrett has a lot of his character material, and Keshi has a lot of his character material. So you have those three. But Aerith's character material is primarily back in Remake, because it's in the Midgar section of the game. Cloud and Tifa's character material is yet to come in the next part because that's where they are really focused on, and Yuffie would basically be there too. Yuffie is a little different because she is an optional character in the original. Her stuff is just chunked up differently, but you don't go to Wutai in this one, for instance, right? So her stuff will come in the next one. So you wind up with the game Rebirth, and again, it matters that this is a game. Just because they did something in another game, remake, that was released 4 years ago, I don't think absolves this game. In the same way that, like, the thing that you can most easily compare this to, although I think this thing is much better in comparison, the Hobbit trilogy. The Hobbit trilogy has a real problem in that Bilbo and Thorin reach this turning point in their relationship in the first movie, An Unexpected Journey, where at the end Thorin, says, I judged you wrong, and they hug and they're all happy. And then nothing happens between them in the Desolation of Smaug. Nothing at all. They barely interact. And then you get to A Battle of Five Armies, and that's where the climax of their relationship is. But we had a full movie in between where nothing happened with them, and that's part of the problem of the Hobbit trilogy. You have the same issue here, but like on a massively magnified scale, where half of your cast is really static in this specific game. And it also means that we're going to have the same problem in the third one, where Barrett, Keshi, and Red 13 will no longer have any new characterization unless they invent something new, which they really haven't yet in these games. So it's this massive problem of chunking it up where I don't think it's necessarily impossible to break out Final Fantasy VII into multiple games, but you would have to go for a much more, rebuild of Evangelion, Hideaki Anno-esque reworking of the story, because this is not a problem in original Final Fantasy VII. The fact that Aerith doesn't have a ton of characterization between the end of Midgar and her death isn't really an issue there, because she was like the star of the show for the first several hours of the game, and her relationship with Cloud is so crucial there, and it's all one game that you don't have to, you don't leave Midgar and then the PS1 says, wait 4 years to insert the next disc.
Yeah, because the original game, right, you get a lot of development, and then she's flat. Like, it's not like she's not there, it's just they don't do a lot of dynamic material with her character. She's there, she contributes to the party, but other characters come into focus and they have the more dynamic character arcs for a while. But, you can't have the character just be flat for the whole game and then dynamic at the very end. That's not how a character arc really works. That's not how a story works, right? And so the fact that all of that dynamic material in her introduction is excised from this game, and so you're just sort of thrown into her, and she's just this sort of generic Aerith character where the game's not doing anything with her. She's just sort of there. It's a really big problem, and it's one of the many things about the nature of the story that means it feels incredibly flat, and that there's no sense that care for how the narrative functions was made in where this is chunked up, because I am 100% convinced the only reason why they chose Aerith's death as the endpoint for this game is because it's a very famous moment. If Aerith's death was regarded in the same way that most video game deaths are regarded, this would not be the ending point, because it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's only because Final Fantasy VII happens to have this very unique position in the history of 3D video games that, for a lot of people, Aerith's death was this, the first time they encountered something like this, especially in a game that was in 3D with the level of production values that Final Fantasy VII had. It's not like there weren't video games, important character deaths that were mostly interesting and powerful in video games preceding it. Aerith's death did not invent that for video games. It just was the right place, right time for that kind of story to be this, flashpoint in video game culture. And so that, coincidence of this sort of larger than life significance in our kind of culture for video game people, particularly of a certain age, means that it ends up carrying more weight than it should for the story that it's in. And so Rebirth making this choice of it's this huge titanic thing, Aerith's death. It's got to be, how could it then be anything but Aerith's death? How could you not just end it there? It has so much weight and gravity to it. It's got to be the end point. It's no, because it doesn't have that weight and gravity because of the moment in and of itself. It has a lot of weight and gravity as a good moment in a good story, and it's well executed, but it isn't the end-all be-all of the story of Final Fantasy VII. It's not even the best part of the story of that game, in my opinion. All the best stuff is after Aerith's death. That's just the turning point that leads into the most interesting section of that story. And so I just feel like the people at Square Enix were kind of blinded by the the thing that is Aerith's death, and that is the reason why it's the end point of this game. Because the story in this game doesn't feel like it's designed even to build up to Aerith's death. It just feels like they kind of put a pin in it there. They're like, well, this is where we're stopping. Aerith's gonna die, and then but we'll do some weird shit with it to make people have theory craft online for 5 years until we get to the third one. At which point they will realize that this is just the same story as Final Fantasy VII with some weird shit in there every once in a while. The same way that there were enough people playing Rebirth whose the scale fell from their eyes. They realized that none of the weird shit from Remake had any payoff here. The cycle will start again. But it's so frustrating. Like, it's just such a frustrating thing to happen to this very good story that you could do a very good remake of, just not like this.
Yeah, this is awful, and I think you're probably right about why they chose to end it here. But if that is the case, why was their decision to do the Aerith death to just open their ass and empty a bag of shit all over it? Because that is the end of this game. I cannot tell you how viscerally offensive I find the end of this game. Like, because I agree that I don't think Aerith's death is the best part of Final Fantasy VII, but there is a reason it is as iconic as it is. That scene, that about 10-minute stretch with you get your full motion video scene of Sephiroth coming in and stabbing her. You get Cloud talking about how she will never laugh or cry or speak again. Then it jumps into the Genova battle where her theme song keeps playing through it. You finish that, and then you have everyone saying their goodbyes, and they all fade from the screen one by one, which is like a really interesting effect to have with polygons on screen in front of the pre-rendered background. And then it's just her and Cloud, and then it is the FMV of Cloud lowering her into the live stream and she falls away. That 10-minute stretch, which I brought up on YouTube and watched again before I finished Rebirth because I wanted to have it fresh in my memory as a comparison, it is one of the best 10-minute stretches in video game history. It is such a beautiful piece of gamic and cinematic storytelling melding. I don't think it can even meaningfully be improved upon. It is so good. And so on some level, I do understand and I empathize with the decision to say, look, we're never going to do a better version of that scene. That scene is fucking perfect. So maybe we go in a different direction. That in and of itself, I don't have a problem with. My problem is to take a scene that is that good and means that much to so many people and to replace it with a J.J. Abrams mystery box scene that feels like it's from a season finale of Lost. Like, that's the kind of thing it feels like, where it takes a scene that is about these concrete emotions and about this feeling of finality. There's no mystery coming out of that scene in Final Fantasy VII. It is just about the emotional reality of losing someone. And then you get to Rebirth, and most of the conversations that have been had online, by me with other people, by other people I have seen talking about it online, just devolve into what happened. Yeah. The basic question coming out at the end of Rebirth is not, how did this make you feel? What does this thematically say? What, rich text is going on here? It is, what the fuck happened at the end of the game? Did Aerith die? Did the timeline split into two? Is there now a sort of Aerith out in the live stream because we had the whole multiverse sequence beforehand, which I also hated, with Aerith like guiding you through the world and all this stuff. And so you do not feel Aerith's death because it doesn't really, you never see it happen in the game. It is off screen, it is implied, there's a split timeline, you get this intimation that the other characters have experienced her death while Cloud hasn't, but a version of her is still very clearly alive and is somewhere in Cloud's imagination or in the multiverse, because we saw that there is some kind of Aerith who maintains all of her memories and is out there outside of this reality. But most conversations about the end of this game, and I've seen this happen between other people that I've looked at conversations online, conversations I've had with other people in real life, where you want to get into the themes of it. And I've seen some interesting interpretations, but it keeps coming back to like, well, I didn't have that interpretation because that's not how I read the ending, because the ending is super fucking ambiguous and unclear about what it's doing. And I just think taking a scene that is that beautiful and like solid in its emotionality and replacing it with a big old mystery box where it's all about speculation about what will happen next or what you were even looking at in the first place. I think if you were drawing a qualitative line between scenes on a goodness scale in video game history. I think Aerith's death in Final Fantasy VII for PS1 is near the top of that scale, and I think the end of Rebirth is near the bottom of that scale. I think they are about as polar opposite as you can get.
Yeah, I mean, it's awful. I mean, it's awful. It's also exactly what I expected. I don't know. It's like, it is the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake, just applied to a moment of narrative significance instead of, and now we're leaving Midgar, which is where they did it the last time. Oh my God. But, there is an interesting thing has happened with some of the game critics I follow, some of whom kind of bought into what Remake says it was, right? Final Fantasy VII Remake tells you that is a story about these characters fighting against fate, in this metatextual sense, right? This is what the feelers or the whispers are. And it's like, and we're preordained fate to do the events of Final Fantasy VII, but we want to fight against that. And we don't want to just follow this path. We want to fight for a better future. And they, quote unquote, destroy fate at the ending of that game, thus giving them this open future of infinite possibilities as they leave Midgar. And if you are a very generous and trusting person that has not an ounce of cynicism in your body, you see that in what the game tells you is happening, and you just go, amazing. This is not a remake of Final Fantasy VII. This is a sequel to Final Fantasy VII, and now like anything can happen, and it's just the possibilities are endless. If you are a person who has maybe played some other Square Enix games, or is just a sort of more twisted, untrusting personality, and is more cynical at heart, you look at that and go, well, that's what you said was happening, but what actually was happening was just the plot of Final Fantasy VII every single step along the way. There was no deviation, including the end point of the game, which is Sephiroth has killed the president of Shinra. Sephiroth has now left Midgar. Our party is now together, and they shall leave Midgar in pursuit of Sephiroth. That, to me, is not a future of infinite possibility. That is a future of one possibility, and that possibility was released in 1997. It's called Final Fantasy VII. You can play it on the PlayStation 1. Right, and it's like, it's the most like hook, line, and sinker style thing they're trying to do of baiting people with this dialogue and these flashy, big, flashy, weird Sephiroth fight sequence, which, just to stop and note, we are going to have to fight Sephiroth at the end of 3 of these games. That is just what they're going to do.
Sucks.
It's fucking hilarious.
So fucking stupid.
It's so funny to me that they just couldn't come up with anything better than that. But anyways, you have your big, crazy, giant, ridiculous battle sequence of Sephiroth that resolves in such a way that, like, did it even actually happen is like an active question, both at the end of Remake and Rebirth. When you look at, like, how those scenes end, you're like, okay, like, did this occur? Was it a dream sequence? Did it take place in a parallel reality? Whatever. I mean, it didn't take place in anywhere because it's all made up. It's just fiction. It's all nonsense. So it's just, it's just particularly nonsensical nonsense this time around. And then like, the tracks get loaded back onto the Final Fantasy VII story, and it just continues as if nothing ever happened, right? If you're picturing this as like railroad tracks, we were going on the Final Fantasy VII tracks. Sephiroth was off on the side, or Tetsu Nomura cosplaying as Sephiroth was there, and he pulled the big handle thing that shifted the tracks. It went, and there was a big loop that came back around, and then it went just back on the tracks and continued, and it was as if nothing ever happened. It just wasted your goddamn time. That is what the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake was, and lo and behold, I said this every fucking time a trailer came out on Rebirth, it is the exact same thing that Rebirth did. There was this bizarre community around these games that when the trailers came out, they would look at the trailers and do these like shot-by-shot analysis of, oh my god, look at all this crazy, what could this possibly mean? And they're just looking at scenes of shit that happened in Final Fantasy VII. I'm like, I know what it means because I played that video game. Like, it's not new. Nothing here is actually new or different. It's all just the same thing, elongated over a much longer game with random little plot cul-de-sacs that it goes off onto, and then it reconnects back onto the track. And at the end, it's going to seem like it could be anywhere because you can't see the rest of the track yet because the next game's not out. But I can fucking guarantee you, I would bet my life's goddamn savings that the next game is just going to be the plot of the rest of Final Fantasy VII with a couple of other little plot cul-de-sacs in there. But it's not going to be different. Aerith is dead. It is not going to be there's a split timeline and Aerith's alive, but she's also not alive. There is a reason why the phantasm of Aerith that Cloud sees at the end of the game does not go with them. Because if she did, it would necessitate different things to happen. It's the same fucking shit. They have just decided to throw little sprinkly dust on it to make it seem like it's fancy and new and crazy and exciting when it is none of those things. And the annoying thing is that all the fancy fucking sparkly glitter that they're getting all over it ruins the shit that was supposed to be there in the first place.
And here is my prediction for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3, is that is where I think you are going to see a collapse of the critical reception of these games.
Yeah.
Because among critics and the fan community, because I think you're going to get to the end, and once you start doing this with once now you have to do an ending. Because with the next one, you have to actually wrap it up. You have to actually finish the story of FF7. And if you apply this plot cul-de-sac bullshit to that, it's going to be, I think, no one will be able to look at it and go, this is good. And people will be frustrated. And here's how I know this will happen, is because the Kingdom Hearts fan community disintegrated in the follow-up to Kingdom Hearts 3. Like, I think if you are not in that community or adjacent to it, you do not understand how much, like, Kingdom Hearts 3 got tepid reviews. Like, they were okay 7 out of 10s from, like, your major critics. Kingdom Hearts fans, the people who played 1 and 2, and 358 Days Over 2, and Birth by Sleep, and Chain of Memories, and all the other ones, hated Kingdom Hearts 3. We could invite Thomas on here and he could tell us all about it. I'm adjacent to it because my brother, I grew up watching him play Kingdom Hearts and I've followed him and I've asked him about it. And the fan community fucking despised that game because it was promised as an ending. It was, okay, Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2 are kind of their own thing, but then there's a million other spin-offs that keep building the story and adding chunks and building onto the house and promising eventually there will be a payoff. And then Kingdom Hearts 3 came out, and it was a big Emperor has no clothes moment. Thomas has used that analogy with me for, like, everyone who cared about those games, because it was hollow. There was no ending. There was nothing to pay off on. There was no real, like, controlling theme or idea to the series. Tetsuya Nomura is the Japanese J.J. Abrams, and he works in games instead of TV and movies. He is someone who spins up stories, but has no interest or talent for ending them. And so his endings are just bigger versions of the mystery boxes, and it ends up being like not just disappointing, but deeply deflating. And I think there's a lot of Final Fantasy VII fans who are not Kingdom Hearts players who think they are playing something other than they are playing. And the main reaction I had to the end of Rebirth is, this is just a Kingdom Hearts game. This has so much more in common with Kingdom Hearts than it does anything from Final Fantasy. Like, I think if you are not into Kingdom Hearts, you might not realize it, but like the aesthetic, the way it is cut, the way it does the boss fights at the end, the last couple hours of Rebirth are a Kingdom Hearts game, way more than they are a Final Fantasy game. And like, I think we are just as liable to get to the end of Remake Part 3, and it brings in the fucking like shadow version of Noctis from Kingdom Hearts 3 that is from Final Fantasy Versus 13, which was the version that before they made Final Fantasy 15, and it becomes part of the Tetsuya Nomura verse that he is trying to build, and there is going to be no satisfying resolution to this remake project. That is way more likely than them sticking the landing.
Yeah, it's so frustrating because it's just like I just want them to tell a story, and it's like there's this certain kind of thing you get, and like obviously J.J. Abrams is like a huge culprit here, and Nomura is as well. There are other examples of this where it's like instead of wanting to tell the story, they want to promise a story. It's like, I'm not here for promises, motherfucker. I'm here for you to actually just do the actual story. And it's so funny that I like followed some of the reaction, or like I went back and like looked at the reaction to the ending on different places like Resetera and stuff like that, the video game forum. And I saw like lots of people who say they enjoyed the ending, but a lot of their thing is like they're spending, hours making or consuming YouTube videos that are about dissecting what really happened and all that kind of shit, which is, just buying into the bullshit. And it's like, when I realized like, oh, you don't actually like this thing. You just like the speculative sport of asking, oh, what could be next, and like playing that game. The thing with that game is, though, it has never worked. It's because it can't. Because it can't. Like, it will never be able to work. But it just makes me think of, like Lost is one of those classic examples of where when it had to actually get to an ending, like the people who their thing with Lost was they just bought into the mystery bullshit, they went fucking rabid crazy and hated it. And like the whole community around that show, I feel like dissolved. But it's old enough now that there are people who like they seemingly almost forgotten about that, and they're like being like, oh, it's like when I would we would get on the forums back in the old days, and a new episode of Lost would drop, and we just spend hours discussing what could it all mean, not in a what does it mean thematically or emotionally, of like what is literally actually happening, what is happening in the story being a point of question for these people. I'm like, do you not realize it's just going to burn you again? Like, what a deeply unsatisfying way to engage with your media, that's what you're seeking, because you're like a junkie seeking for that like bigger and bigger high. You'll never be satisfied if that's what you're after, because what you're after is a thing that doesn't actually exist. You're just chasing after this fucking dragon. And it's wild. Like, I just can't really understand the mindset of people that this is the thing that they are like getting excited by, because to me it just looks like a fucking snake oil salesman, and I just kind of laugh and walk away from it.
Well, it's like to bring it back to J.J. Abrams, this is the thing about the blow up that happened with Star Wars The Last Jedi, the Rian Johnson movie, is that The Last Jedi, I think there's this weird part of the memory of the sequel trilogy that The Force Awakens did one thing, and then The Last Jedi ignored all that, and then Rise of Skywalker ignored all that. And that's not true. The Last Jedi is extraordinarily generous to The Force Awakens.
Yes.
It takes every character, every plot thread, every idea Force Awakens has, and it tells a story with them. And part of why there was such a massive, like, toxic blow-up around The Last Jedi is that The Last Jedi wanted to tell you a real story. Like, what are we going to do with Snoke? Well, Kylo Ren is going to fucking murder him and then take over. That's a real story. What they wanted is Snoke is Darth Plagueis and he's going to do and like 5 other things, right? And, we're going to meet Luke, and Luke is going to have this, this, and this, and he's going to go through an arc and all of that. And you can disagree with the characterization of Luke, but a lot of it was that people didn't ever want to see the story. They wanted the speculation wheels to continue spinning. And The Last Jedi ends in such a way where it has told you a story, and if you were going to continue The Last Jedi, you would have to tell another story. And J.J. Abrams brought in, and he decided not to, and he did The Rise of Skywalker, which is barely a story. It is something else entirely. And, like, there is this segment of fandom that wants those things, and they misread stories. This doesn't even happen just on shows that are mystery boxes. You were not a active Mad Men viewer back in the day, Sean, but I was. And I remember the battles around. There was a small segment of the Mad Men fandom that watched that show as though it were Lost, even though there is nothing in Mad Men that tells you that it is going to be like Lost. But like, there was a whole segment of the fandom convinced that Don Draper was actually D.B. Cooper, the historical figure who hijacked the plane and then like jumped out and was never seen from again, and that was going to be the finale of Mad Men, and that his ex-wife Megan was actually going to be oh my god, the woman killed by the Manson family.
Sharon Tate.
Sharon Tate, yes, that Megan was going to go to California and change her name and become Sharon Tate, and that she was going to be killed by the Manson family, and that the finale was going to be the Manson family and D.B. Cooper, and this is what was going to happen. And there was a part of the Mad Men finale or Mad Men fan base that hated the finale and like last season because it didn't end with Don Draper jumping out of a plane with $100,000 in unmarked notes, and it didn't end with Megan being murdered by the Manson family. And like, people online are a little bit fucking insane, and I do blame people like Tetsuya Nomura for making them this way.
That's why I had never heard any of that. Man, I gotta watch Mad Men, but for different reasons than you did. I want to go see what set these people off. Like, what? Like, it's fucking crazy. Yeah, it's just like, because here's the other thing is that like it's not even worth engaging, right? It's the thing of where I watched. Or, I played the ending of this game. I just said I watched the ending of it, which is really more the reality. I mean, there is an incredibly long, tedious, like, it has to be almost an hour-long boss fight. It's so long against Jenova, and then it's Sephiroth, and then Zack gets thrown in there. Zack, a man who has got to have less than an hour of screen time in this game, despite being on the fucking cover art. Which, I mean, I'm grateful for. I don't want any of the Zack in this game. I love Zack. He has his own game. It's amazing, and just don't fucking touch it anymore. I like that game. I just leave it alone. Just leave Zack alone. He's a great character. He's dead now. Let's just move on. But they have him. You have your big, Cloud and Zack fight Sephiroth, and Cloud sort of kind of vaguely remembers Zack, but he can't actually remember Zack because that would unravel everything. You couldn't do the plot of Final Fantasy VII anymore if he did. So we just sort of like had him be like, I think there was a guy named Zack that was at Nibelheim, huh? And that's about as far as Cloud gets, which is a hilarious moment to add to the story, just to set up him seeing him. And then fucking Aerith shows up out of an in-game portal, and she's like, let's do it, Avengers Assemble. And then they fight Sephiroth, and it just goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. And then... And to set the speculation aflame of like, is it a multiverse? Is it happening inside the live stream? What does Sephiroth mean? Well, let me go get let's look at the Japanese translation. Well, he says Hoshi here, which means planet. And it also means star, and he says Sekai. So there's like the Hoshi has lots of different Sekai in it. And it's just like, no, stop. If that's what you're doing and you're trying to like figure out what's the mechanics, the multiverse, live stream, is there a real world? Is there not? Is it a split timeline? No, you are doing the wrong thing. You're playing the game. You can't play that game because the dealer always fucking wins, because it's all nonsense. None of that means anything. It doesn't matter that there's a different graphic of Stamped the Shinra dog in the different timeline / universes / fractures of the live stream, or whatever the fuck you want to call it, because none of that shit is real. It's all made up. None of it's real. It's just a fictional story. None of it makes any sense, because none of it has to make sense, because it doesn't actually obey any rules. Like, funnily enough, we're going to get to Doctor Who here not too long, and there's an episode of Doctor Who that just aired that is completely germane to this conversation, the way that I found very amusing, about, like, people trying to project rules onto things that do not have them. And so there's that whole, fan base is like looking at that shit. What you should actually pay attention to is that at the end of that giant boss fight, Sephiroth just sort of leaves, and everyone's just there, and Aerith is dead now, and the scene continues as though none of it happened, which is the funniest thing in the history of video games. We went across, like, in the fucking cosmos. We were fighting Sephiroth, we were fighting the end boss of Final Fantasy VII, literally, like, it's that version of Sephiroth, in a fucking, like, the Eaglehead Nebula or some shit, and a dude that we've never seen before came out of a time portal and fought with Cloud, and then Aerith, who was dead, is now here, and it's like, all this shit happens, and then we're just, and now we're back. I'm like, in that boss fight, wasn't the entire temple, like, destroyed, and they were, like, falling on these giant pieces of rocks and finding the different chunks of the Jehovah monster and all this shit? Like, Jenova, whatever. It's the same thing.
I just like the idea of they're fighting Jehovah.
It's, there's a reason why they called it Jenova.
No, there is.
Like, all that happened, like, this whole place should be completely destroyed. But, of course, you couldn't do this scene if this whole place was destroyed. And so it just, like, Sephiroth leaves, it all goes back to normal, and nobody comments on it. Nobody says anything. And, like, we just have to pretend like, none of that happened. We didn't have the giant hour-long fucking, one-winged angel music boss fight, like, spectacular extravaganza. Oh, right, Aerith's dead. I guess we have to go be sad again now. And it's just so fucking funny. Going back to my metaphor about the tracks, that, like, we go back onto the original track, and this one is a pretty bumpy connection to get back there. Like, it doesn't really line up quite perfectly, and you all have to just sit there pretending as if the train didn't practically flip all the way fucking over trying to get back onto the track here, and just assume that it's just all part of the experience, and it's fine. And let's just go and do some weird version of the post-Aerith's death, but be incredibly vague about it because you want to be vague about it. You want to give people the hope that, Aerith could potentially have lived based on the way they played out this whole weird scene in the multiple timelines. But of course, she is dead. Like, that's my reading, is that she's dead for like the purposes of this reality, but also for the speculators, like, it doesn't matter if she's alive or dead because she's not here. And so you can read it literally, you can read it metaphorically, you can read it however you want. It doesn't matter. She is dead, and all of their weird spectacular extravaganza doesn't change any of that, other than the fact that because it throws it into this weird room of speculation, even though that room of speculation is completely insignificant and its outcome doesn't matter, the fact that they put it in there, they put in this fucking Schrodinger's fucking cat box, means they can't reflect on it, you can't grieve over it, you can't feel anything for it, you can't emote around it. It just has to be this weird Schrodinger's cat scenario, and you have to be so fucking coy with it that you just don't get to have any of those scenes have any real emotional resonance to them. And it's like, it just feels like the game plays itself. It wants to be this like all things to all people by playing up the speculation game, but in so doing, it can't be anything to anybody for reals.
Yes, exactly. And about that cul-de-sac point, I've heard, again, different interpretations of the ending where people were telling me, like my friend Chris, why they found it moving or effective. And one problem I have with it is that any version of that has to contend with that you have your couple minutes of cutscenes where Aerith doesn't die and then does die, and then you have your couple minutes at the end where everyone else is sad, but Cloud is acting like a lunatic because he's talking to someone no one else sees. And in the middle, you have an hour-long boss fight that never fucking ends. And I am banging the table, and I know I'm not supposed to do that as a podcaster, but I'm going to put this through the level later, and hopefully it'll work. But I cannot express how much, it doesn't work when you make me play the world's worst boss fight for, a solid fucking hour in the middle of this, and, that doesn't say anything. It doesn't use the mechanics to say anything to me. It is just complete nonsense busy work. The version of this in original Final Fantasy VII is 3 minutes. The Genova fight you have there is a little tiny boss fight that you have to contend with through your fatigue. It is more a kind of life goes on moment than anything else of Aerith is dead, but we still have to battle, remind you of that. It's not there to be a skill check in the game. It's certainly not there to be your hour-long final fucking boss fight. And then you come back. The pace is so fucking borked.
Yeah.
I often reach for the Hobbit comparisons here because it is the closest piece of media I know that has done something like this. But the Hobbit trilogy by Peter Jackson is, in comparison to this, the most perfect piece of pacing in human history.
God, I'm just thinking about that really great scene near the end of the last Hobbit movie where Bilbo is grieving over Thorin,
yes.
Which is an amazing scene. Martin Freeman acts his ass off. It would be so funny if you're just in the middle of that scene, and then all of a sudden a troll runs up, and Bilbo has to fight a troll for an hour in this big, epic John Wick fucking, Pirates of the Caribbean swashbuckling action scene, and he fells the troll, and Bilbo goes, oh, Thorin, oh, you were my friend, oh, and he has to just go back to that pretending like that whole sequence didn't happen.
Yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole problem of who is Sephiroth at this point in Final Fantasy VII Remake?
This is something I want to talk about as well.
Because, I will give it this one praise. The most pleasure I got out of the last couple hours of Final Fantasy VII Remake, or Rebirth, I should say, is that Sephiroth's voice actor, Shinichiro Miki, right? That's someone else. Sorry. It's who plays him? It's Toshiyuki Morikawa.
Yes, Morikawa.
Morikawa, sorry. I was looking at Miki played him in a game called it's Airgaze. He played him in the fighting game. Toshiyuki Morikawa has played him ever since then.
Sephiroth's most famous appearance in Airgaze, the PS1 fucking fighting game. God Save the Ring?
Yeah.
Is that the subtitle of that fucking weird game?
Yes, that's the subtitle. No, but it's been Morikawa ever since. And Morikawa is a tremendous actor. I think he gives the best performance in these games. His Sephiroth is just so incredible, and I love hearing that. But at the same time, Sephiroth is an utterly empty signifier. It's not clear at any point, is this the Sephiroth from our universe who fell into the life stream and then is controlling the bodies and killed the president of Shinra? Is this the God thing that is controlling the timeline? What is he? What does he want? We're so far removed from that. We've already fought him and beat him once. Now we're going to fight him and beat him twice. And then in the third game, maybe it'll finally stick. Who the fuck knows? But it's frustrating because Sephiroth can be such a deep, rich, interesting character, play Crisis Core for more. But like, not here. It's just he's the theme park version of Sephiroth. He is the same as like if you go to Disney World and you go to Star Wars Land and someone comes out in the Darth Vader suit and they're probably really good at their job and they've got the voice changer and it's really cool. You get to go take a picture with him. Your kid might go up and do a little lightsaber fight and it's really fun. But it is not, if you were then to take that and put that version of Darth Vader into the movie and expect the richness that you get in like Return of the Jedi, you'd be really frustrated. And that's Sephiroth in the remake games. He is the Sephiroth you get at the theme park. He's still got the voice. He still cuts the figure really well. But it's an empty signifier.
Yeah, it's very frustrating because I guess my read on what he is, because this is the thing I was like for a long time, like, what even is Sephiroth anymore? And I guess I have to assume that, like, there is only one Sephiroth there, that he does not exist in the, like, separately in different multiverses. There's just an Sephiroth that exists outside of that, which is confusing because it seems like there's kind of an Aerith that's that, but there also clearly are Aeriths that aren't that. But I don't think that there is, like, this universe's Sephiroth in Rebirth. I just don't think that exists, because the scenes in which Sephiroth is there in the original game, that is in this stretch of the story, which there are multiple scenes that he is actually physically there, or at least he's controlling a clone that is physically there. But for all intents and purposes, there's a Sephiroth there who is talking, who does things. He's not there. And it's one of the things that makes the story so tedious, is because in the original game, instead of you just following dudes in black robes who are nondescript weird zombie men, you're following Sephiroth, like the main antagonist. Like, he's there. He's actually there. He's just one step ahead of you the whole time, right? And then a couple of times you catch up, like on the boat or at Nibelheim, and you have a little interaction with them. But there's an actual physical character there. And it's just so tedious, the fact that he's not physically here. It's just hallucinations that Cloud has, as far as you can tell. Or if they're not, they might as well be, even if they're not supposed to literally be his hallucinations and that Sephiroth is actually manifesting. You can't tell the difference between those two things. And it just makes that whole stretch of the story so tedious. And it ruins some really cool moments. Like, the one moment from the original game I think is really memorable and is super cool in how it sets up Sephiroth is the whole thing with the giant snake monster near the beginning, where in the original game, it's this thing you have to sort of like work your way around and get the chocobo and all that stuff. And then eventually you turn a corner, come into like this area where you have your sort of pre-rendered backgrounds of the original game. And that thing is just impaled on a fucking tree. And Cloud sees him and he's like, did Sephiroth do this shit? Oh, fuck, right? And it's this moment of like, so that's the guy we're trying to fight. He's not just like a guy who can cut off the head of Shinra. He can just sort of impale a giant, like, 30-foot snake monster on a huge tree. And that's just the kind of dude we're contending with. It's a great moment. In this game, it's sort of vaguely, there's a vision of Sephiroth, and it sort of does a thing that I guess throws the snake up when you're in the middle of a boss fight with it, and it gets impaled. Like, that's not the same thing. That doesn't perform the same function. Like, there are moments in the original game that set Sephiroth up, then be this interesting antagonist character that you are constantly on the heels of, but can't quite catch. And here, it's just, he's just sort of out there, I guess. And there's these black robe guys, and we got no better clue, so I guess we'll follow them. And you just do that the whole fucking game. And it's a huge loss in terms of the story. That it's like, especially with how much longer the story is here, you need something to, like, these moments to sort of like lock things back into focus and get you back onto the main sort of storyline. And that's what those moments with Sephiroth did in the original game. And you don't even have those here. And it's one of the things I think makes the game especially flat, even more than it would be otherwise. Like, is one of the things that's frustrating about the game is that there are lots of things the original game did that you could have done and just brought forward very simply in your remake, and it would have fixed some of the problems of the story. And it's just kind of hard to understand why you wouldn't have done it, other than if you're really precious about the mechanics of how this multiverse thing works, I guess. And so you're like, we can't have a Sephiroth there, which I don't know why not. It's also not a literal Sephiroth, because it is a clone that Sephiroth is manipulating from the live stream in the original game anyways. All they've done for Sephiroth regardless in this is they've just taken his same plan from the original game and just scaled it up to be multiversal now. So it's not just the planet, it's the multiverse version of the planet, and I want all versions of the live stream, not just our version of the live stream, which is like, that's the same plan. It's not a different thing. You just have sort of like moved it up one level or a notch, but it's fundamentally the same storyline.
It's like in Austin Powers when Dr. Evil says he demands $1 billion,
Yes.
and then they say, well, with inflation, that doesn't really mean much, and he says $100 trillion, and everyone's scared. It is fundamentally the same plan. He's still stolen the nuke.
Yes, that is a very good comparison, where it's like, it's completely pointless. It doesn't matter what number it is. It's the same thing. And that's exactly what they've done with Sephiroth here, and it's frustrating. I love to have Morikawa chew the scenery. I love him going, Kudo. And just like in that, and having him show up and go da 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 ba ba ba, like that's fun. That's fun every time it happens. It's some of the most fun I had in the story in this game. It's not good though. It's just because I like Sephiroth. Like I would get the same or really better like version of that if I just watched the fucking Smash Brothers Sephiroth trailer. Like it's the same fucking thing.
Yes. Or again, if you went to Final Fantasy Land and you got to take a picture with someone in a Sephiroth costume. That's what this is. Fundamentally. Oh my God. Okay. Part of this was also exacerbated for me because I was finishing this while I was watching. Listeners know I watched this show, the original Berserk anime from 97, where Morikawa plays Griffith. And there's just something about seeing Griffith. And I know Berserk 97 doesn't get through all of the manga, but it gets through the part where, let's say, Griffith's story reaches a turning point.
Yes. It's the majority of his appearances in that story. They get through the bulk of it there. Yeah.
So, I got to hear Morikawa play an entire character arc. And then I get to come here and it's like, he leans in and goes, Graudo. He's fucking phenomenal. He's the best at this. But, no character there, I'm sorry to say.
No character there. One other thing, this is a complete tangent, but something I forgot to mention the last time we talked about it, and I just wanted to bring it up. One of the other disappointments I had with this game is I was very excited before I played Rebirth to see how they're going to do Yuffie's introduction, because it's such a memorable part of the original game.
Yes.
For people who haven't played the original game, Yuffie, who is an optional character, you do not have to have her in your party. There's a point in the game where she just shows up as a random encounter in the overworld, and she's trying to steal your materia, and you fight her, and that triggers a sort of dialogue sequence afterwards and all this stuff. But it's an incredible moment where you just have this random ninja girl trying to steal your shit, and it's just a regular random battle, and it's fucking awesome. And I was really excited. Oh, what cool thing? How are they going to interpret that moment for this game? Because it's just one of my favorite parts of the original Final Fantasy VII. I think it's such a cool video gamey thing. And they just fucking give up. They don't even try. They don't even try anything. They just say, she's just in Junon now. I don't know. You just run into her. She's just at the dolphin bit, and you just get her. I'm like, I didn't expect her to be a secret character that you could have possibly missed, but not having it be you're running around in the open world in Junon and you're just doing your random side shit stuff, and then this ninja girl just runs up and jacks your materia and runs away, and you have to chase her and fight her, and then she gets into your party afterwards. It would have been so much cooler. There's lots of little stuff like that throughout this game, where the original Final Fantasy VII is a very creative, inventive game, and it does a lot of stuff that's very cool, either in terms of its visual presentation, its narrative mechanics, or how it mixes that with gameplay. And the Yuffie thing, it's just one of my all-time favorite ways a JRPG party member has ever been introduced is Yuffie, and it's so lame. It's so fucking lame. And it makes me think back to one of my criticisms and issues with the end of the Intergrade Yuffie DLC, was that where they end with her is very boring, and they have this very long post-credit scene with her in the desert, and I was like, why don't they have her spot the party on the horizon and see they have materia and be like, I gotta get that materia. And I realized the reason why they don't do that is they've just sort of made that in a completely extra extraneous part of her character now, and the fact that she's just really wants materia so bad, and she's just going to jack your materia at any chance she can get. That's just not really part of the character, which also means they're not going to be able to do the great other thing she does in the original game, which is she fucking takes all your materia and fucks off to Wutai, and you have to go chase her, which is fucking great. And these games don't have the courage of the original Final Fantasy VII to do anything fucking interesting, and it's a bummer.
Yes. No, I agree. It's inexplicable why wouldn't it be you get to Junon, Yuffie comes out and steals your shit, and then that is part of the open world objectives is to get back your shit. You have to go do like several objectives in the open world and meet Yuffie, and like you would have to make it, I understand you would have to make it essential to the story, because making her optional doesn't work with a game like this anymore, right? There's too many cutscenes she's in and things like that, right? So I get that. But like, that would be one way you could make the world of Junon, which is like the most missable. You can just fuck off.
Yes.
You don't have to look at anything in Junon. You can go straight to the city. You can ignore all of it. But you could make it something where you actually have to go like explore the region and like look for the clues Yuffie left behind and like follow the trail of the stolen materia. How cool would that be? Being a good game. This isn't a good game.
It would be great. There's this really great JRPG that they could take some notes from. That I think if they brought some of those elements forward to this game, learn from their ancestors, their predecessors, it could work really well. It's a game called Final Fantasy VII. If they took some of those ideas and put those in this game, I think it would be better.
I agree. Sean, here's the thing. I think when you add up everything we've been talking about today, and then some other issues we haven't even gotten into, like the game's incredibly inconsistent visual presentation, there are parts of this game that look gorgeous, like anything with the characters, and then like there's a lot of the open world that looks like a PS3 game. Like it feels so ancient and outdated. So many of the controls are so bad and finicky, and it's just so uneven as a presentation. Like, this is the worst AAA game that I have played in a long time. I know there are probably worse ones out there, like a Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League or something, but I didn't play that and neither did you, and by you I mean everyone listening to this. But in terms of ones I've bought and played to completion, I honestly don't know. Like, the last one I disliked as much as Rebirth in the end.
I think I agree, yeah. I mean, the last time I think I had a really strong negative reaction to a game that was this sort of like high budget was probably Breath of the Wild, but that is like a very particular thing to me. Like, this is the thing where like I'm not surprised or confused by why people love Breath of the Wild and it didn't work for me. I think that's a good game, that just is not for me. Whereas for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, like, I'm legitimately confused by some people's reactions to it. Like, yes. I'm confused by how people are able to look past some of the stuff in this game that I think is like truly bad, like really, really bad. Not just the narrative stuff. Obviously narrative stuff can be very like individual person to person. There's just some like simple game design elements that I'm just perplexed that it's not a bigger issue. When I look at the reaction to Final Fantasy 16 amongst the Final Fantasy fan base, where there are a lot of people that did not like that game, and they give all these reasons about like, oh, it doesn't have blank blank and the other thing, or it's like they don't like the side quests, they don't like the pacing, and like the side quests and the pacing were some of the big criticisms of 16. I'm like, but you think Rebirth's pacing and Rebirth's side quests are better than Final Fantasy 16? And I'm like, am I losing my fucking mind? Like, what are you people talking about? I think 16 has some issues with its side quest design and some issues with its pacing. But compared to this game, like, it's confusing to me. And so, yeah, I would agree that this is the first game in a long time that was this kind of high budget production that has left me so befuddled by what it is. Like, even far more so than Final Fantasy VII Remake, a game that I have problems with, but a game that I liked enough to put on my top 10 games of the year list. Like, it's not going to matter if I have enough time, and they're very likely I will not have enough time based on how long every fucking video game I've played and I'm planning to play this year is, that I will probably play fewer than 10 video games this year. This isn't going to be on my top 10 games of the year, though, because I just don't like it enough for it to be considered a good game to be put on that list. Whereas Remake, I would stand by this, like, I think it is. Like, I think it's got enough problems, and it's certainly not like an amazing game, but it's a game I enjoyed more than enough that I felt good putting it on a top 10 list. I would not do that for Rebirth.
I don't like either of them, but I'll tell you this. If you put a gun to my head and said which one would... we're going to kill you if you do not play either Remake or Rebirth again to completion, I would pick Remake every time, because it is about a third as long, and it doesn't have as many annoying pieces of shit in it.
You can get through that game just fine. And it's got enough, the story of that game is so much better. Because it gets to do the introduction. So you get to get introduced to all the characters. You get to meet Aerith and Tifa and Barrett and Cloud, and Cloud's a much more interesting character in that game. That game starts falling apart at the 2/3 point at which they, start to have you constantly fall down random holes to climb yourself back out in order to pad out the length of the game. But at least like the overall narrative of that game is still pretty functional, regardless of the ending. Whereas with Rebirth, like the idea of going through this on a hard mode is just crazy to me. Even though I think I would enjoy the combat a lot. Like I enjoyed the combat in this game. I would like to play a harder version of it. And wish that hard mode was available just from the beginning, or you could switch at it partway through or something. But I can't imagine having to slog your way through the story stuff, which isn't skippable. You'd have to go play the fucking bad Rocket League minigame as Red 13, you know? I'd have to go do the pirate fucking shooting minigame. I'd have to, there's so much random horseshit. I'd have to do all the box throwing as Ketchy again. That's so slow and tedious that I just couldn't fucking contemplate replaying this game. I would happily, if I had enough like extra time, there wasn't other stuff I was doing, I would happily replay Final Fantasy VII Remake again. I have no problem with that. That game is not well paced, but it's better paced than Rebirth. That's for fucking sure.
Well, most games are. Yeah, here's another issue. And this comes down more to like the fundamental ontology of what this project is like if you are a fan of Resident Evil 2, the original PS1 game, but you understand that the kids today, or people, you know, raised on modern games, might not be so into the fixed camera angle tank controls thing. But Resident Evil 2 means something to you. You want to share it with someone you love, with a friend, something like that. Oh, great, there's this remake for the PS4 that just came out. And you know what? It is not the exact same game as the PS1 Resident Evil 2, which means I can have a lot of fun with it. But does it get a lot of the core of what I loved about this game such that I can now share it with these other friends who aren't so used to tank control games but could play an over-the-shoulder shooter like Resident Evil 2? Yes. And that is the function of a lot of modern remakes of games from this era, is the ability for them to kind of live on even as gamic language has changed around them. Can you imagine giving these games to someone who hasn't played Final Fantasy VII and like it would be impossible. They rely on, even though they retell the story slavishly, they also rely on you knowing that story, which makes it extra boring and stupid. But like, the ending of both of these games would be complete gibberish. The Zack section of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which isn't that long, but they do keep cutting back to every chapter, would be completely incomprehensible because you would have no point of reference for who Zack is, and it doesn't get across anything of what was actually like at its core special about Final Fantasy VII for PS1, so it completely fails as a remake that will keep this game alive. There's been a lot of questions about, like, Rebirth has apparently not sold very well in comparison to Remake. And I think there's a lot of consternation over what it is, and to me the answer is pretty fucking simple, which is that Remake, by virtue of being a game called Final Fantasy VII Remake, looked like it might be something for a bigger audience who didn't play Final Fantasy VII, and by the end of that game, it was clearly a for fans only thing, and Rebirth is even further in that direction. The audience is extraordinarily self-selecting for this game, versus something like Resident Evil 2. You could have never touched a Resident Evil game in your life, and you could love that game and that remake. Same with the 4 remake from a couple years ago. And this is not that kind of thing. These are games that basically should have a fucking homework check at the beginning of, have you played this, this, and this? All right, you are cleared to play Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And that is not how you make a high-selling video game. I don't know what to tell you.
Yes, no, I agree. I think that is like the fundamental issue with the sales here. There's like, I think, other stuff going on as well. But the big problem is, I think you've got any newcomers, I think or the majority of newcomers were likely sort of scared away by Remake, or they felt like satisfied enough by it, but maybe confused enough that they aren't, you know, urged to go and get the sequel that also takes 4 fucking years to come out, you know? So it's like, it's a long time between the two games. By the time you get there, they've probably forgotten most of what the story was, particularly because it would have been confusing to them in the moment. But I also think there's the more casual Final Fantasy VII fan that probably played Remake and had their fill, and they were like, "Oh, I got that hit of like seeing the high resolution, you know, fucking billion polygon whatever version of Cloud and all that stuff, and I got the music, and you see Midgar, which is this very iconic part of that game, and the aesthetic and all that kind of stuff, and you did it." And I think a lot of the people who are more casual fans probably just like sort of played Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1 or whatever, and had their fill of the Final Fantasy VII Remake idea, and aren't necessarily like, you know, super into. I want to play another one of those and then another one of those. It's just not grabbing their interest. So I do think the audience just is getting smaller and smaller to the point where I'm curious to see with the third game, like, what do you do? Like, you know, I assume that they have, like, obviously, like, you know, the work for each game gets easier because they're using the technology, right? This is still built on all the same stuff that made Remake. So it's like, you know, it would be an incredible sunk cost fallacy thing to try to get rid of the third part of this trilogy. I'm sure they're going to put it out. But it is definitely a thing where it's just a smaller and smaller slice of the pie each time you're doing this. And I wonder, like, what kind of effect it will have on the legacy of Final Fantasy VII within the video game community in the long run. Because Final Fantasy VII, before these remakes, enjoyed a, like, legendary tier status, where even if you're someone who did not know that much about video games, like, Final Fantasy VII was one of those games that was put up on a pedestal. I don't know if that's really the case anymore, or certainly if that will be the case by the time this remake thing is done. I think, like, getting it all this exposure in this kind of very compromised form that is performing sales-wise so relatively poorly, this is certainly not keeping it alive to another generation, and I think it's maybe causing people to rethink what love they had for Final Fantasy VII in the first place in the long run, in a way that's sad. I don't know. Like, it makes it feel like they should have just left it all alone, despite the fact that this was the thing that people asked for forever. If you're going to do it this way, you probably shouldn't have done it at all.
Well, but this isn't what anyone... Nobody asked for these games. Nobody asked for this. People were asking for... Like, I think if you say, I want a remake of Final Fantasy VII, there's not a lot of ambiguity there. You know what that means. You mean, make it like you would make a modern game today and retell the story. There's a lot of different ways you could go about that. You know, even in the Resident Evil remakes, we've seen different approaches to how you can do that. But that is not it's not hard to conceptualize, I guess is what I mean. You know, and, like... I think sometimes, you know, you say this and then people are like, oh, you just want the same story again. And, like, to some extent, yes, but also no. Like, Resident Evil 4, the remake that came out last year and is one of the best games released this whole fucking generation, it is in some ways very faithful to the story in the letter of Resident Evil 4, the video game from the GameCube, but it is also very different and it shines a different light. And you've talked about this a lot. Like, it allows you to understand Leon S. Kennedy as a character in a very different way than the original, in a way that feels like it augments and, like, is a nice companion piece. And the gameplay does that as well, where, like, it doesn't in any way, to me, replace original Resident Evil 4, but it feels like it has enhanced my appreciation. And I think Resident Evil 4 has just bought itself another 3 decades of legendary status by having that remake. And I think it has also bought itself more decades of the original version being replayed and re-released as a companion piece. Whereas I think it is entirely possible that this project will have just kind of killed Final Fantasy VII for a long time, until, like, PS1 games in general get kind of a renaissance.
Yeah, it just sort of, like, I just feel like the energy around this brand and franchise has changed a lot after Remake came out and then now after Rebirth. It just feels weird, and it's a bummer. As someone who, you know, is a latecomer to the Final Fantasy VII thing, because I just played it right before Remake came out because I wanted to finally play that game. I was like, oh, this game's actually really good. And then little did I know that that shortly afterwards, Square Enix would start trying to sort of squeeze my affection for Final Fantasy VII out of me, that I'm holding on desperately to. I was like, no, that game is good. Crisis Core is good. Like, these things are good, and you cannot change that. I don't care what bad video games you make or your terrible fucking CG movie you made. It's like, no, you cannot take these good games from me.
Oh, I will say this. These remake games have made me love original FF7 and Crisis Core even more. Like, they are such good counterexamples that, like, my love is enhanced for those, not in the way that, like, Resident Evil 4 enhanced my love for Resident Evil 4, more out of spite than anything else. But yeah, like, I really wanted, and I might still sometime this year replay original FF7, because, like, I'm like, I want to go see the actual story. I want to see the story where things happen and characters change and, you know, there's no mystery box shit. I want to see that again. Yeah, it was good.
The thought I had is I might download a Japanese ROM and play it on my 2DS, just like to get a different version, because I can speed up the combat on an emulator just like their fucking the PS4 version. Because that's the dark secret of why I like Final Fantasy VII, is also the combat in that game is terrible. But you can skip it basically with modern emulators, so it doesn't matter.
You could probably also, couldn't you just buy the Japanese version of the port on PS4 and just play it on your Japanese account?
Yeah, but I also want just something that's like the more authentic PS1 graphics and stuff.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. All right. Well, are you going to be playing the third remake game?
I don't know. I don't know. That's a bad question to ask me one day after I finished Rebirth.
I know.
Because I want to say no, but I know I'm going to. I know I'm still curious enough. I gotta, at the very least, I'll watch most of it in a fucking YouTube playthrough if I don't play it myself. Because I'm so morbidly curious about like what they do to fuck it all up. Because I know they will. But yeah, I'm not excited to. Let's say that.
Yeah.
Whether or not I will, that's a question for like me 4 years in the future when I'm in my mid fucking 30s. Good lord.
I mean, but here's the other question: if they really take another 4 to 5 years, and we're on like the fucking PS6 because this generation is going to wind up being a little weird blip asterisk that never mattered, and it still is built on the tech from Remake. Like, that's going to be the most... Because this game already feels like it's 10 to 15 years out of date, technically. What is that going to look like? Your PS6 game that looks like a PS4 game that... Oh, my God.
Yeah, I want Unreal Engine 6 to be out, and this game's still built on Unreal Engine 4. That's where I'm at. I want, like, every video game has ray tracing, and then fucking Final Fantasy VII Reunion or whatever comes out, and it's like, nope, here we go. I hope you don't want to look at textures too close because, some of these rocks, they still look like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, Sean, you want to shift over and talk about something good?
Yes, Jonathan, let's talk about something very good.
All right, Doctor Who, we have had 2 episodes in the last 2 weeks. Let's just take them in order, Sean. We're going to have to move through these a little faster than normal because we've already recorded for a while.
I'm on summer break, motherfucker.
I'm on break, but I do have a dog over here who is panting and wants to go out, so we'll see what we can do.
All right.
But Sean, let's start with Boom from last week, written by Stephen Moffat, the man himself, the longtime showrunner of Doctor Who, directed by Julianne Robinson. And I would say this is the best episode of Doctor Who since the last time Stephen Moffat wrote an episode of Doctor Who in 2017. Would you agree?
Yes, the man still got it. It's kind of almost crazy how much it feels like just like a long lost Peter Capaldi episode of Doctor Who. Yep. Almost in that way of, where you'd sometimes get those scripts like Robot that were basically made in part for the previous Doctor. And then they're like, oh, well, we'll just sort of like rejigger it up and stuff and refresh the script for whoever the current guy is. And we'll just put it out there. It almost has that feel. Obviously it's not like, obviously he wrote the script fresh for RTD and for Ncuti Gatwa, but it is, man, it's a hell of an episode of Doctor Who.
It's a hell of an episode, and I think on that point, Sean, the thing it underlined for me is just something that has always been true, that if there's one thing Stephen Moffat is better at than I think any other Doctor Who writer, it is the voice of the Doctor. He is the best at that. And he is also the person who has written, I think, for the most Doctors in his life. If you're just going through televised stuff, he wrote for 9, 10, 11, 12, and now 15. And he also created the War Doctor and wrote for him, and wrote Eighth's regeneration scene in the little Night of the Doctor short. So he's and the Fifth Doctor.
Yeah, Fifth Doctor in Time Crash, I was going to say.
Yeah. So he's written for like most of the extant.
The First Doctor in the Twice Upon a Time. Obviously a different actor, but yes.
So yeah, he's written for like the bulk of the extant Doctors in the series. And he is so good at both understanding what is universal about the Doctor's voice, where you can write a line and you can imagine anyone who's ever played the role saying it, and what is specific to the voice of the Doctor at a specific time. And I think this script is such a good example of it because, yes, like you can feel that the most recent Doctor Stephen Moffat wrote for is Peter Capaldi because there's a bunch of dialogue in this that sounds like 12th Doctor dialogue. But there's a real benefit for that, being that this is Ncuti Gatwa's 4th episode, in that Ncuti Gatwa gets to kind of step into the shoes of a longer lineage of the Doctor and really feel like he is like inheriting the role in a really cool way, because this is also just a much darker version of the Doctor than we've gotten in Ncuti's episodes so far. But then Moffat is also really good at understanding specific things that like are in Ncuti's voice and mixing those together. And it leads to, like, I think the best showcase Gatwa has had so far. A great story overall, but just one where it feels like you are feeling the legacy of all the Doctors in Ncuti's performance, and that's something I love in this one.
Yeah, and I think that feeling is enhanced by the fact that this is his first episode not written by Russell T Davies, right? Which obviously RTD has been doing a fucking stand-up job ever since he came back, and he's had basically hit after hit. Some of them better than others, but all of them have been at least good. But it is nice to have another voice come in at all, just to sort of like flesh out this characterization of the Doctor for Ncuti Gatwa and give him a slightly different voice for the character written by a different writer. But it is even extra so when it gets to be Stephen Moffat, and he gets to sort of put all of his, take on the Doctor in here, which, as you say, feels like it's such a kind of universal take. It really reaches into the heart of the character, and it feels like it could be any version that is saying most of these lines.
There's this exchange he has in the middle with the Verata Setu character, who we need to talk about because she's our next companion. But
yes.
Monday Flynn is the name of the character. And this is such a good example of him mixing the Doctors up. I love this. He says, I am a higher dimension life form. I am a complex space-time event. And she shoots back, I'm Anglican. That is the most Stephen Moffat exchange in history. But then he continues and he says, I am a much bigger bang than you bargained for. I'm a lot more explosive than I look. And honey, I know how I look. Put a quantum chain reaction through me and I will shatter this silly little battlefield into dust. All of it in a heartbeat into dust. And I love how that speech starts out, and you can hear Matt Smith giving it, you can really hear Peter Capaldi giving it, and then around the time he starts doing the alliteration around much bigger bang than you bargained for, only Ncuti Gatwa is saying that. Like the way he says it, especially, and then the I'm a lot more explosive than I look, and honey, I know how I look. That is a 15th Doctor line, if ever there will or was one. And like, I love, Stephen Moffat is so good at that. That starts as a universal Doctor kind of big speech and ends up being this perfect 15th Doctor speech. And the episode is just full of moments like that.
Yeah, it's an absolutely phenomenal performance and the characterization for the Doctor that just gives us a very different valence for Ncuti Gatwa to play. But obviously, like, the thing with this episode is the centerpiece of it, and the thing that makes it feel like one of his Capaldi episodes for Moffat, where Moffat had each season he had his mid-season episode, right? He had Listen, then The Girl Who Died, which was co-written with Matheson, but also Moffat, and then Extremis in season 10, which I think Extremis is maybe the one that most feels like this. But all of them are episodes that are, particularly Listen, Extremis, kind of a little bit gimmicky in concept. Like, they're very high concept episodes that are a little bit weird, a little bit off kilter, even compared to other Moffat episodes where you can feel him pushing himself and really reaching for these ideas. And so for Boom, the story for how Moffat came up with this episode, which is a story that if you're a fan of Doctor Who, you know this exactly. You don't need to be told this if you're a fan of classic Doctor Who. Is he was just watching the beginning of Genesis of the Daleks, and there's a part of the first episode of Genesis of the Daleks where you got 6 of those fuckers for that one, but normally 4 episodes. You got some shit to fill out. So there's just a 3 to 5 minute long sequence of that episode where the Doctor steps on a landmine, and then Harry, who's one of the companions that's just for that one season, and Sarah Jane's the other one, they have to get a rock and put the rock on and sort of to balance out the weight and all the shit and get him off the landmine. And it's just a little kind of minor part of the introduction to Genesis of the Daleks, just to sell you on the idea that they're on a battlefield, and to give that kind of World War I, World War II kind of feel to it. But Stephen Moffat was watching Genesis of the Daleks. He saw that part. He's like, I can make an episode out of that. And that's the whole episode. And it's awesome because it's basically just a stage play. This is a point they made in some of the behind the scenes stuff, but it's very true that because it's all, with the exception of a little bit of stuff in the cold open, it's all in one location. They're in this big crater. The Doctor stood there, and the whole gimmick of the episode is he's on the landmine and has to solve the episode when the only thing he can do is talk to people. And so it sort of limits the Doctor's sort of range of the things he can do, and limits him to the thing he does best, which is talk people into whatever the Doctor needs to happen here. And it's such a good gimmick. It's so pure, and it gives the episode such a fun quality to it where it is very theatrical, to the extent where I would love for them to do a theater in the round performance of this, where the edges of the crater are the audience up there, right? And you have Monday coming in out into the audience, and she's talking, and Ruby runs up and goes combat, gets shot, and she rolls down the steps of the theater onto the stage at the bottom. It's such a great theatrical concept, and the way it's shot, in the set and everything they have, I think it just executes on this core premise, which is a very gimmicky but a very fun creative premise, so perfectly. And it's just one of the pleasures of this episode. That's the kind of episode that really, Doctor Who's the only show that could really do this episode,
Oh, absolutely. No, I love that. It's kind of funny. My brother Thomas, after he saw this, said that looked like the most expensive bottle episode in TV history.
Yes.
And that's basically what it is, because it kind of is a bottle episode, but I think that loses that the whole purpose of a bottle episode is to be cheap. I don't think this episode was cheap. I think this episode was expensive as shit. Because if you've watched the behind the scenes stuff for this episode, if you haven't, because the set they built is incredible.
Yeah.
Like it is not obviously they built the whole planet, but that crater, more of it was real than I thought from just looking at the episode. They built that entire crater in the round, all of that detail, what Shooty is standing on, all of that stuff. And then there is like an LED wall, like the volume doing some of the extensions, and there's some green screen and all of that stuff that you would expect. But the basic set that they are on is one of the most and they said this in the behind the scenes, it's one of the most crazy elaborate sets they've ever built for Doctor Who, and you can really feel it, because it's kind of easy to imagine the classic Who version of this, because it would just be Genesis of the Daleks. It would be in a quarry, right?
Yes.
They'd be shooting this in a quarry, and they'd be standing there, and it would be fine. But there is something about the Disney money that they have allows it to look really special. But it does have that theatrical quality, and it is just 45 perfect minutes of Doctor Who with this laser sharp high concept, but it is a high concept that allows you to focus the Doctor to his absolute essence. And as you say, this usually would be more of a mid-season, or I think for the Doctor, more of a mid-run kind of episode. And to have this so early in Shooty's run, I think just cements what a great Doctor he is out of the gate, because I think this is most comparable to something like Listen in that regard, where that is Capaldi's 4th episode. And I think most Doctors couldn't pull off Listen 4 episodes in. A lot of Doctors are still kind of finding their tone 4 episodes in, but this is just we've been off to the races from the moment he regenerated.
Yeah. So that whole side of the episode, just phenomenal. But then the other thing it has that I think I'd love, that's a very Moffat-ish, is it does have a laser focus on its central themes, where it has its bigger social themes, which are fun because they're just very angry in a way I enjoy, of the fucking war and the algorithm and religion and all these things that the Doctor is just sort of gets very dark in a way that's very satisfying, just sort of the way he lays out the whole scenario of this war, of these soldiers being ordered by an algorithm basically to fight themselves, stepping on their own landmines, being saved or killed by their own ambulances over and over and over again in order to keep the capital industrial machine of war just going and going and going, even though they waged war, as he says, on an empty planet. That's a fantastic reveal that's very kind of biting and intense. But there also is underneath that, I think, this sort of other fundamental theme about mortality and what death means that's very powerful.
Yes.
And the memory of people as they live on after us, both represented with that AI, but then also the religion element. And the ending of this episode I just find incredibly beautiful, where you have these conversations around faith, where the Doctor has just so many good lines where he says, you've got to keep the faith splice. And Monday tells him, I thought you didn't like faith much. And he says, just because I don't like it doesn't mean I don't need it, which I think is a great line. But then you have the ending, the kiss off line, which this is the other thing that's the most fucking Peter Capaldi. I hope at a fucking convention, where fans will ask at conventions, actors who have played the Doctor, they'll give them one of the big speeches another Doctor had and be like, oh, do this speech. The Rings of Akaten one is a common one. This isn't a huge speech, but I would love to hear Peter Capaldi do a reading of this, because it's so good. And obviously Shooty Galvin fucking kills it also. But at the end, Ruby asks him, but her dad's dead. I know he's not gone, and that's sweet and everything. It's just he's dead. And the Doctor says, we're all dead eventually. There's hardly any time that we're not dead, which is a good thing too. We've got to keep up the pace, otherwise nothing would get done. Dying defines us. Snow isn't snow until it falls, which that's the other most Moffat line of the script. And she asks, snow. Yeah, snow. We all melt away in the end, but something stays, maybe the best part. A sad old man once told me, what survives of us is love, which that's from a Phil Larkin poem. But it's such a beautiful little speech that reflects on everything that the episode is talking about, of this sense of mortality and the cruelty of the way that these people have been killed, but that despite that cruelty, that the love that survives past those people is what wins this war and brings hope to this whole situation. And comparing it with the snow that we get, where we have another one of those hints of like the weird metaphysics of the snow from the church on Ruby Road being here as Ruby is like dying, and using that metaphor of snow melting like us dying, but it leaves behind this water, which symbolically is life-giving and all this kind of stuff. Like, just such an amazing piece of writing that puts such a fine pin on a really nice central theme that I think every single part of the episode builds on. And that's the thing that Moffat is so good at. I think is the thing that most Doctor Who writers struggle with, because Doctor Who's such an insane show that has so much shit going on and has to reinvent itself every single episode, that finding a way to do all the other things that Doctor Who asks you to do, and then also have this kernel of a theme that never gets lost along the way, I think that's just like a real difficult thing that you need a very talented writer like Russell T Davies, who I think is also good at this, and Stephen Moffat, who's especially good at it. Or going back to the old days, this is a thing that like Robert Holmes, the classic Doctor Who writer, was just unbelievably good at, finding that kernel and never letting go of it and having it blossom at the end into what this episode was all about and the story was about. It's so good.
No, I couldn't agree more. The ending of the episode bowled me over. I mean, this is also such an, more than like just about any Doctor Who episode I can remember, an affective episode. Like, it gets you on the edge of your seat. I was like leaning forward. It's incredibly tense, and I think when it gets emotional, it moved me to tears at different moments. Like, it is so beautiful. It is also so harrowing. Like, it's really rare to have the Doctor facing death in a way that feels like death to the Doctor, but like this seems like he is scared in a way we very rarely see the Doctor scared, and I think it affects us. And then those last couple minutes are so beautiful. I definitely had a tear in my eye by the time this ends. And again, don't want to undersell what Ncuti Gatwa is doing with all that material, because boy, it also, I think, is very specific to his take on the character, that he is a Doctor who emotes in this way and he has tears come to his eyes and that kind of stuff. It's beautiful. But yeah, it's an incredible episode. It's, I think Stephen Moffat's best ever episode is Heaven Sent, and probably always will be. But this is like in whatever the tier right under that is. This is like this is as good as any of the ones he did for, RTD back in the day when he did one a season.
Yes. And I think one of the things that's nice about it is it feels like, there was this segment of the Doctor Who fandom that got very negative about Moffat's run. And it always just like frustrated me that there was this insane thing that people would go on about, that like, oh, well, Peter Capaldi he's a great Doctor, but given really bad writing. And I just could never fathom that opinion. But I think I see a lot of people kind of turning around on that now and seeing this, because Boom is written, this is the exact same kind of script he would have written in the Peter Capaldi years, because it's a different kind of Moffat script than he wrote in the early RTD years. It's as good as any of that stuff, but that's, he's evolved as a writer over time. Despite what his naysayers might say about him, like, he's changed quite a bit. But this has that same kind of quality as the last time he was writing Doctor Who. And there's so many people that loved this episode. And I kind of saw a little bit of a sentiment of people looking at, oh, maybe I should give that stuff a second look. Which, if you're someone listening to this who didn't like the latter Moffat years or checked out and didn't watch the Capaldi stuff, but you really loved Boom, like, you got a fun journey ahead of you, because there's 3 seasons worth of those kinds of episodes. Obviously, not every single episode is as good as this, but even a lot of like the other non-Moffat episodes, they're more in this kind of vein, because obviously he was running the show as well. And it's why the Peter Capaldi years is the best era in the history of the show. Thing I still believe and would defend. And I think you see those same qualities here in Boom, and it's just nice that even though he took a long time off of Doctor Who, a very well-earned break, what seemed like would be a forever break off of Doctor Who, I'm glad that is not the case. And we also know he's written another episode. I think the next season's Christmas special is also a Moffat one.
It'll be the 2024 Christmas special.
Yes,
so
right.
This December we'll be getting it, yeah. Which is awesome, too, because here's the thing. RTD, wonderful Doctor Who writer, he was never that good at the Christmas specials. Stephen Moffat was really good at the Christmas specials. I'm kind of glad he's handing it off to someone who I think Moffat always had more enthusiasm for that format, and I think RTD's felt more like, I have to get this out of the way and do this. There are some good ones. I like The Runaway Bride. That's the one I like. Sorry. I feel bad for saying that. And not all of Moffat's Christmas specials are great. The Doctor, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is bad.
Oh, yeah.
But, like, mostly they're very good. So I think that's a cool move that they're doing. But yeah, like, I understand the perspective of some Doctor Who fans who fell off after Matt Smith because, to be fair, you and I will be the first to admit, Matt Smith's final 2 seasons are really rocky. Like, they are, that is the weakest run of Moffat. But I think when you put them in the context of the 6 seasons Moffat did, they're a clear period of growing pains where he is transitioning from, like, season 5, the first Matt Smith season, is the Moffat who wrote those 4 RTD episodes, making a full season like that. And then season 6 and 7 is him transitioning into the guy who's going to write the Capaldi run. And the Capaldi run is, if it's not the greatest, it's that, or it is the first 3 seasons of Tom Baker. Yep. Those are the 2 greatest eras of Doctor Who. And I think it's hard to argue with that. And yeah, if you I can understand, because you and I also, it took some growing pains to adjust to what Series 8 was doing when that aired. But I think when you look back at it, like, you know, just if you haven't done it in a while, go back, start with Deep Breath, and just experience some greatness, because absolutely Boom feels like it could have been in Series 9 or Series 10. And I'm glad it is here in Series 14, because, hey, there was a long time there, Sean, where it felt like we would never get an episode of Doctor Who this good again. But here we go. This is an all-timer. Yeah,
it's phenomenal. And it's just fun also to do the behind-the-scenes stuff and see him and RTD together again in particular.
Yes.
But I think you can see, it makes so much sense why Russell T Davies would immediately go to Stephen Moffat, because it's like you forget, like, because this isn't just the Stephen Moffat that wrote the episodes for RTD. This is the one who also ran the show. So It's like he's like one of the only other people on the fucking planet who understands how hard it is to run Doctor Who. So it's like, so Moffat also has an executive producer credit on this episode and on his other episode. And it's like, oh, right, because he ran the show for over 6 years. So it's like, yeah, like it's got to be like very reassuring to have someone else there who understands the, like, what you need to do to put together an episode of Doctor Who in that kind of way, because almost nobody else can do it.
Indeed, absolutely. So, Boom, wonderful. We love it. One other thing to talk about here is that we did meet the next companion, effectively, because Verada Setu, that actress who plays Monday Flynn, there's a great line about if Monday and Ruby ever got married, their children would be Monday Sunday, which is great. Anyway, or if, no, they changed their last name.
Yes.
But anyway, that's a fun line. But that actress is going to be a new companion in the following season. Obviously, we're not sure what character they will be playing, because this was kind of a one-off, and we'll see what they do with that. But this is the actor who will be the new companion in the next season.
Yes, sort of like, presumably, a Karen Gillan-esque situation where she was in Fires of Pompeii for a smaller role in that than this. But yeah, and I liked her. I mean, it's one of the strengths of the script. Again, another thing that Moffat was usually very good at. Was building good single episode characters. Also, thing that Davies is very good at amongst Doctor Who writers, like building one-off characters that show up for an episode, are very memorable, they stand out to you, and you like them. And I think all the different characters in that episode stand out very well, her in particular. So yeah, like I'm excited, and I'm curious to see what that means for like Ruby and all the other kind of stuff there with what comes along with companions, but.
Yeah, they've been a little cagey about it, but it seems like Millie Gibson is still filming, so it seems like it might be a 2-companion season, which I'm all for. But especially if we have more than one interesting companion, that'll be great. We didn't get that in the Chris Chibnall years. Yes. But no. Yeah. And I'd seen her before. She's in Andor, the best Star Wars thing since the prequels.
I have also seen Andor, so... Who did she play in that?
She is, I don't think it's a huge character, but she's one of the rebels. Her name is Cinta Kaz.
Was that the one where they like go and they have to like infiltrate the one or the story arc where they have to like infiltrate that one building or whatever?
I think so. She's the medic in the episode in Aldani. Yeah, that one.
Yes, I think I know the character you're talking about.
Yeah, not a huge character, but was there in Andor. Very good. All right. So you want to talk about the newest episode, 73 Yards?
Yes.
Which is our Dr. Light episode. Apparently, I did not realize this while watching, but then in the behind the scenes they explained part of it is because Ncuti Gatwa was still finishing his work on the show Sex Education on Netflix, and that's what he was doing while this episode was filming. Although I don't think that's the only reason why they did a Dr. Light episode, but this is basically our something that we both said last week we wanted, a more of a Millie Gibson showcase, because she had not been a huge focus yet. And in Boom, she's really only there cognizantly for about half the episode, and then she's on the ground. But here we go. This is our full Ruby Sunday episode. It is another Russell T Davies does a horror episode, and it continues my thesis that he is at his best writing horror episodes, even though he's really only done it 3 times. But those 3 episodes, Midnight, Wild Blue Yonder, and this one, I think are 3 of his best episodes. I don't know if this is on the level of those other 2, but I liked this one an awful lot.
Yeah, I like this one a lot. Also, I do think, like, it loses me a little bit in kind of the middle point, and then it gets me again. I think once it gets into the weeds about the, like, Welsh prime minister guy and all that, like, that starts to get, I think, a little bit long in the tooth for me for what the episode's doing. But it's also, it's another very kind of high concept, weird episode. I think it's almost intentionally a not very Doctor Who episode. Like, it makes the interesting choice of that does not do the opening title, so it doesn't do the theme song, which I don't know if they've said what the reasoning is, but it reads to me of like, this is not an episode of Doctor Who. This is like, this is more different than an episode of Doctor Who usually gets, and I'm into that. There's definitely, I've seen a little bit of mixed reaction online, but I think some of that mixed reaction is people reading this like it's supposed to be a normal episode of Doctor Who, rather than the horror movie that it is, because this thing is absolutely working on like weird kind of low-budget horror movie, like high-quality, low-budget horror movie logic, in that there isn't much logic. It is a nightmare. Like, she's literally living through this kind of nightmare version of reality where there is this woman who is always 73 yards away from her. No matter what is happening, nobody can go interact with that woman. If anybody tries to, they run away and cut themselves out of Ruby's life entirely, and she can never find out why. And she just has to live out her entire life stalked by this weird spectral figure. And it kind of controls her entire life. She can't hold down a relationship. She can't be with anybody. And it dominates everything. There's this whole subplot in the middle about the Mad Jack Welsh prime minister dude who's going to destroy the world with nuclear winter. Like, that stuff feels like it's a little bit worked in backwards to give there to be something more active for the episode in the middle section. It doesn't feel as organic to me as the rest of the episode, so that loses me a little bit. But the central sort of premise and that whole side of like the horror movie element of it, I think, is incredibly well executed on and is legitimately like chilling and frightening, but also I think speaks to something really powerful about Ruby's character and Millie Gibson's performance, that feels like it is representing this nightmare version of her fears of abandonment and people leaving her, right? She, like, the doctor just disappears seemingly out of thin air, and her mother abandons her. Anyone she reaches out for abandons her, and it prevents her from being able to connect to anybody. And that's like the thing that she fears most. I think this is just like such a cool way of presenting that idea to the audience that is very unexpected and gives Doctor Who that different kind of flavor that you feel like RTD has been pushing for since he came back with doing for the more supernatural stuff. And this is by far the hardest he's pushed in that direction, and I'm here for it.
I'm 100% here for it. I really loved the decision not to use the theme song, which I believe is only the second time in Modern Who they've done that. The other time is the first Chibnall episode, the first Jodie Whittaker episode doesn't do it because they were doing the Prestige TV thing. Yes. If you don't do the theme song in the first episode, that was dumb. This, though, I like because you realize how weird it is to start an episode of Doctor Who and not have it. It's part of what makes it so eerie, is that normally you would land in Wales, they would get out of the TARDIS, they would do a couple of things, and then eventually the theme song would break in, and kind of once the topic of the episode is established, but it never breaks in, and the Doctor just disappears. And I think the lack of the theme song is part of what makes it feel so eerie, but also does cue you into that this isn't really an episode of Doctor Who, it's an episode of, you know, Ruby Sunday's nightmares. And I have seen the criticism that it's good that we got a big Millie Gibson showcase, but because this Ruby won't remember what happened in this episode, does it really tell us anything about Ruby? And I disagree very strongly, because everything this episode tells us about Ruby, it's not about specific events that matter for future episodes of Doctor Who. It's about who is she as a person? how does she react to like stress and abandonment? What are her fundamental fears? What does she do in extremis? Like those sorts of things. And that, it doesn't matter whether she remembers this nightmare at all. This is akin to an episode of Twin Peaks going inside Cooper's head for an hour. Like that's the kind of thing that we're doing. And I feel like I walked out of this with a much better understanding of who Ruby Sunday is and what performance Millie Gibson is giving than I had before. And it makes me even more excited for the back half of this season.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it makes her, to me, a much richer character because we've really delved into her subconscious in this very unique way. And yeah, like I think it's the instinct that some people have of wanting the contiguous narrative that is building on each part. Like one, Doctor Who doesn't typically really do that in a particularly meaningful way anyways. It's rare that it actually tries to, even in modern Doctor Who. But especially for what this episode's going for, that's just not the point. Similarly, I've seen some like the criticisms of it of like, that to me just feel like kind of missing the point of people being like, oh, well, they never reveal what is the weird phantom woman saying to these people that is making them run away. And if that's supposed to be herself from the future on her deathbed looking back at herself, like it's like, no, that's not the point. Like it is a nightmare. Like she's living through a nightmare. It is the fairies playing tricks on her in this like Grimm's fairy tale style. And so trying to, the episode literally lampshades this, where Kate Stewart tells Ruby, like, people try to apply rules and logic to things that do not have them in order to be more comfortable with the things that they don't know or understand or cannot control. And so I think that's part of the episode, is telling you in that moment that trying to collapse what is happening here into a thing that's like, oh, well, she's just saying the magic words, and this is a weird alien woman, and all those things that in a more normal episode of Doctor Who, you would have those kinds of payoffs. The episode is giving you lots of indications, like with the fake out at the pub early on, where it's like, oh, it's going to be the Mad Jack, who is probably like an alien who landed on Earth and was killed in Wales or whatever the fuck it is, but they're actually just fucking with her, right? It keeps on telling you, like, this is not that kind of episode. It's not ever going to collapse into a simple episode of Doctor Who that's going to give you an easy explanation where the Doctor comes in and says a bunch of shit and then waves the sonic screwdriver around and it saves the day. Like, it's just not that episode. And I think the episode does more than enough work to communicate to the audience that's what it's doing, that I think a lot of the criticisms I've seen feel very off base, that it's like you should have been more active in sort of picking up what the episode's putting down, because it's not trying to be that subtle with it. It's telling you very directly what kind of episode it is. By the time you get to the midpoint, like, you should be taking a lot of those kinds of criticisms and putting them out of mind, because they don't apply to the kind of fiction this is.
And, you know, we've just in the last segment spent a lot of time praising Stephen Moffat. But here's the thing. I can imagine this as a Stephen Moffat episode where those would be the questions.
Yes.
Because Stephen Moffat would give you the answers on these things. He would be building... Stephen Moffat is like the good universe version of J.J. Abrams, where he has mysteries, but they pay off, right? Mm-hmm. You know, is something he likes to do. But one of the things I really love about RTD, and specifically when he does horror episodes, it's why he is so good at this, even though he so rarely does it, although he's done it twice in the last year, so hopefully we get more of these, is that he understands, I think, what makes things scary is often the inexplicability of it. Like, that is something that really works in Midnight, and it is something that really works here. And this is true of all of his horror episodes, is that on a production level, they're pretty simple. Wild Blue Yonder has a couple of big effects with the Doctor and
Catherine, or
Doctor and Donna, like, becoming the big monster versions of themselves. But the main effect in that episode is just the Doctor and Donna playing multiple versions of each other, which is a simple, you know, blocking thing in your special effects, right? And it's what the actors are doing. And this is kind of the same thing, where there's no, like, grand special effects to sell what this is doing. And the main thing with, like, what is the woman saying? It would be so much less scary if we ever found that out. Because what on earth could she be saying that would be as scary as us imagining what it is, you know? And I think that is something that RTD is so good at when he does horror like this, is it is those spaces and those silences and these inexplicable things that become so fearful. You know, one of the reasons why I still think Midnight is the best episode he's ever written is that episode ends with the Doctor freaked the fuck out, and he is not okay. And Donna realizes, like, I've never seen you not okay like this. And for the audience, you realize, yeah, usually the Doctor rebounds by the end of the episode and he's in the TARDIS bouncing off the walls. But no, like, David Tennant looks like he needs some therapy at the end of that episode, and it's part of why it hits so hard. This episode feels the same way. Like, this episode does not resolve on an easy note where you're like, and we tied it all off in the bow and everything's okay. There's a little bit of like, oh God, I need some time to myself after this just to think over what I watched. It's intense. And I agree that I think the Mad Jack part in the middle is probably where it gets a little more slack in the pacing. But one thing I do like about it is that the episode starts with this very folk horror kind of thing. The kind of thing that A24 has done a lot of recently with like Midsummer or The Vavitch, or The Witch, if you want to call it by its false title. That kind of folk horror thing. But then it kind of, I like how it makes this transition into it's the Manchurian Candidate for a few minutes there. And it is, but the Manchurian Candidate, if the Manchurian Candidate, his, like, the thing that triggered him wasn't like his mother with the cards, but this weird thing following him from 73 yards, and he had to get, the assassination was getting into the right position on the field. There's something about that I like, that whole movement, and I think it's very well directed. Even though I think, yes, the strongest parts of it are sort of the folk horror things at the beginning and end. I will say, and it didn't bother me because the episode works on dream logic, Millie Gibson, very talented. I do not buy her as a 40-year-old woman. I can say that. They basically, all they do is put her in a wig. I did think it was funny. They were like, we're not really going to make Millie Gibson look like she's 40, so let's not really even try, and that's fine. I did breathe a big sigh of relief when we go another 40 years ahead, and they just had an elderly actress playing her. I was very worried we were going to get Millie Gibson in horrible old age makeup at that point, and I was glad they went with the sensible thing of just cast a talented older actress. That is how this should be done.
Yes, and it makes the whole ending play so much better. Like, it would be pretty hard if it was just supposed to be her in old age makeup. There's something about having a legitimate, like, very elderly actor play that part where they carry, like, the weight of their life there in a way that a younger actor just can't do, right? It kind of like, yeah, it's the ending I think is phenomenal, like everything they do at the very end. For me, I think the thing with the Mad Jack stuff is, I think the biggest weakness of this episode is it just shouldn't be 50 minutes. It should be a lot tighter. Yes. Like, I watched these episodes with my dad, and afterwards he made the comment of, like, I mean, it basically felt like a Twilight Zone episode, which I think is very true, but a Twilight Zone episode is also 25 minutes long. And I think, like, that length would suit this kind of story a bit better, because it can you can communicate the time so much in montage that I just don't think you need, like, the full 50 minutes. And if they cut it down a lot tighter, you can keep a lot of the Mad Jack stuff in there. I just don't think it needs to be as long as it is. I think the, like, element of that story of her trying to take control of this thing that is following her and use it for something, and yet that doesn't solve the problem, like, that to me is a really great moment. The fact that it doesn't change anything in terms of she still has to live out the rest of her life with this 73-yard crazy ghost woman following her all over the place. She kind of comes to terms with it to a certain extent, but, like, doing this good deed does not sort of just fix that. She has to complete her full loop, and before the fairies or whatever forgive her for her trespass. I just think that you could have done that in a much kind of smoother way than this very long middle section with that.
Oh, no, I agree with that. I think it is 49 minutes. It is too long. It should be about 40, I think, is maybe the max you would do for this. You know, Boom is 5 minutes shorter than this, and Boom feels like it's obviously a lot more incident-packed. So, yeah, that's that. But honestly, that kind of feels like the kind of criticism where I'm like, but I don't care that much.
Oh, yeah.
It's so good. It's like, who cares? This is golden stuff. This is great. This is one of RTD's best scripts. I mean, it's good stuff.
Yeah, I also thought it was a very well directed episode, which makes me excited for next week. It's the same director, Dylan Holmes Williams, and I just thought, like, the quality of the direction here was really phenomenal, because it's an episode that relies so much on how it's presented. Obviously the writing is very important, but compared to Boom, right, the dialogue in Boom is so just electric that it doesn't rely on the director being as exceptional in order to communicate how good, like, that stuff is on the page. Whereas the episode that Russell T Davies has written demands a lot of the director being able to show this stuff in a way that's really effective to the audience. And I think that, Dylan Holmes Williams just knocked it out of the park.
100%. It's one of the best produced episodes of the season so far, and they've all been well produced. And we are now halfway through the series.
Yes.
We are 4 out of 8. And I was kind of worried coming into this season. We're down to just 8 episodes. That's so few. Is this going to be enough to feel satisfying? If they're all this good, go for it. Like, this is a great season so far. And, you know, if the weakest we have so far is Space Babies, I'll take that. That is a good season of Doctor Who. And this feels like pound for pound, we are getting a full season's worth in these 8 episodes.
Yeah, and especially if we don't have to wait 2 to 3 years to get the next batch of episodes. Yes. Like, I'm fine with an 8 episode thing here. You know, I'm very excited for also getting to the episode after next, which will be a different set of writers as well. I mean, Russell T Davies has been fucking phenomenal, but there was a very nice breath of fresh air with Stephen Moffat being like, you do need other voices in the room. You do need other writers, not necessarily just Stephen Moffat, but other people coming to the show and doing interesting ideas and giving a different voice to the show. So I'm also very excited for that one, to just kind of see those writers and what their takes are as well.
Me too. And we'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about that. The weekly stuff is going to be bi-weekly, or is bi-weekly twice a week, or is it every other week?
It's both. It's you know, one of the futile elements of the English language is that those sorts of things mean both things at the same time, which is frustrating because they mean very different things. You know, if you do something bi-monthly, doing something twice a month or doing something once every 2 months is very different. But there you'd say use the same word for both.
So what I mean is every 2 weeks. So we'll be back in 2 weeks for episode 499 of this podcast. We will be reviewing the next 2 Doctor Who's, but also we should just let you know, 499 and then 500. We are hitting 500 episodes. That's a big number. Do we have plans? Yes. Episode 499, we are going to be doing a very fun top 10, and then we're going to be doing a sequel to that top 10 in 500. We are going to be counting down for episode 499 our top 10 favorite anime theme song openings. And then for 500, we're going to be doing our top 10 favorite anime ending themes. And I think these are much requested lists. They're ones we've wanted to do for a while, and it felt like a fun way to hit 500 episodes.
That's a lot of episodes, Jonathan.